Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Just keeps getting better. Happy Thursday. I'm Johnny, and today we're trying out Ant Legion for the Swarm. It's a pretty addictive little mobile game that I've been playing over the past week, where you build an ant empire and you go out and you adventure for sandwiches and snacks and goodies, and you fight other ant colonies, you train up your ant base, you level up your ant queen, and as you can see, we're running a campaign right up here. You can check out that QR code, download the game for yourself, see what you think about it, and whatever you do helps me to achieve my goals. So I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you watching, whether you're on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Kick, or X. Thank you for being here. Also, as an added bonus, our soundtrack of the day is going to be Lex Fridman's podcast number 426. For you guys who don't know who Lex Fridman is, he's an Austin-based MIT brilliant mind who's had 400, count them, 400 multi-hour episodes with some of the brightest minds humanity has to offer. In today's episode, we're going to be checking out his interview with MIT professor Edward Gibson on human language, psycholinguistics, syntax, grammar, and large language models. This ought to be a pretty interesting one. If you don't know, now you know. I hold a pretty deep interest in things like AI, language models, consciousness, things like that. So Lex never fails to have a good episode, whether it's, you know, episodes like Chris Voss, the classic FBI negotiator, interviews with people who have explored the Amazon. I mean, the guy always has good material, great questions, and always gets you thinking. So for today's episode, we got about a 3-hour stream where we're going to be hanging out, playing the Swarm over here on this side of the screen while we listen in for some of the best bits of information in this podcast. I'm looking forward to it. This is a great way to enjoy something passive in this game that's going to keep us engaged. So do yourself the favor, use the QR code, download the game, hang out, build up your ant empire, join the clan, whatever it is you're going to do, and let's get on with some awesome knowledge here from Lex Fridman and Edward Gibson. Thanks for being here, and let's get started. If you got questions about the game, just let me know. I'm pretty far into it. I've been playing it for a minute, so just let me know if you have any questions. Deal? Deal.
All humans would have words for exact
Let's
counting,
Mhm.
and the Piranha don't. Okay, so they don't have any words for even one. There's not a word for one in their language, and so there's certainly not a word for 2, 3, or 4. And so that kind of blows people's minds off.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure what
that
he's
is
talking
blowing
about
my
right
mind.
now,
That's
but they
pretty
will
weird.
get
How
to
are
it.
how are you gonna ask? I want 2 of those.
You just don't, and so that's just not a thing you can possibly ask in the Piranha. It's not possible. There's no words for that.
The following is a conversation with Edward Gibson, or Ted, as everybody calls him. He is a psycholinguistics professor at MIT. He heads the MIT Language Lab that investigates why human languages look the way they do, the relationship between culture and language, and how people represent, process, and learn language. Also, he should have a book titled Syntax, A Cognitive Approach, published by MIT Press, coming out this fall. So look out for that. This is the Lex Fridman podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Edward Gibson. When did you first become fascinated with human language?
As a kid in school, when we had to structure sentences in English grammar, I found that process interesting. I found it confusing as to what it was I was told to do. I didn't understand what the theory was behind it, but I found it very interesting.
So when you look at grammar, you're almost thinking about it like a puzzle, like almost like a mathematical puzzle?
Yeah, I think that's right. I didn't know I was going to work on this at all at that point. I was kind of a math geek person, a computer scientist. I really liked computer science. And then I found language as a neat puzzle to work on from an engineering perspective. Actually, that's what I sort of accidentally, I decided after I finished my undergraduate degree, which was computer science and math in Canada and Queen's University, I decided to go to grad school. That's what I always thought I would do. And I went to Cambridge, where they had a master's program in computational linguistics. And I hadn't taken a single language class before. All I'd taken was CS, computer science, math classes, mostly as an undergrad. And I just thought, this was an interesting thing to do for a year because it was a single year program. And then I ended up spending my whole life doing it.
So fundamentally, your journey through life was one of a mathematician and a computer scientist. And then you kind of discovered the puzzle, the problem of language, and approached it from that angle, to try to understand it from that angle, almost like a mathematician or maybe even an engineer.
As an engineer, I'd say, I mean, to be frank, I had taken an AI class, I guess it was 83 or 84, 85, somewhere 84 in there, a long time ago. And there was a natural language section in there, and it didn't impress me. I thought there must be more interesting things we can do. It seemed just a bunch of hacks to me. It didn't seem like a real theory of things in any way. And so I just thought this seemed like an interesting area where there wasn't enough good work.
Did you ever come across like the philosophy angle of logic? So if you think about the 80s with AI, the expert systems where you try to kind of maybe sidestep the poetry of language and some of the syntax and the grammar and all that kind of stuff, and go to the underlying meaning that language is trying to communicate and try to somehow compress that in a computer representable way. Did you ever come across that in your studies?
I mean, I probably did, but I wasn't as interested in it. I was trying to do the easier problems first, the ones I thought maybe were handleable, seems like the syntax is easier, which is just the forms as opposed to the meaning. Like you're talking about, when you're starting talking about the meaning, that's a very hard problem, and it still is a really, really hard problem. But the forms is easier, and so I thought at least figuring out the forms of human language, which sounds really hard, but is actually maybe more tractable.
So it's interesting. You think there is a big divide, there's a gap, there's a distance between form and meaning? Because that's a question you have discussed a lot with LLMs, because they're damn good at form.
Yeah, I think it's what they're good at, is form.
Yeah.
Exactly, and that's why they're good, because they can do form. Meaning's hard.
Do you think there's, oh, wow. And I mean, it's an open question, right?
Yeah.
How close
Good
form
point.
and meaning are.
Yeah.
We'll discuss it,
Yeah.
but to me, studying form, maybe it's a romantic notion, gives you, form is like the shadow of the bigger meaning thing underlying language. Form is language is how we communicate ideas. We communicate with each other using language. So in understanding the structure of that communication, I think you start to understand the structure of thought and the structure of meaning behind those thoughts and communication, to me. But to you, big gap.
Yeah.
What do you find most beautiful about human language? Maybe the form of human language, the expression of human language.
What I find beautiful about human language is the some of the generalizations that happen across the human languages, within and across a language. So let me give you an example of something which I find kind of remarkable. That is, if like a language, if it has a word order such that the verbs tend to come before their objects, and so that's like English does that. So we have the subject comes first in a simple sentence. So I say, the dog chased the cat, or Mary kicked the ball. So the subject is first, and then after the subject, there's the verb, and then we have objects. All these things come after in English. So it's generally a verb, and most of the stuff that we want to say comes after the subject. It's the objects. There's a lot of things we want to say that come after.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of languages like that. About 40% of the languages of the world look like that. They're subject, verb, object languages. And then these languages tend to have prepositions, these little markers on the nouns that connect nouns to other nouns or nouns to verbs. So a verb like, a preposition like in or on or of or about. I say I talk about something. The something is the object of that preposition. That we have these little markers come also, just like verbs, they come before their nouns. Okay, and then now we look at other languages like Japanese or Hindi. Or these are so-called verb final languages. Those is about maybe a little more than 40%, maybe 45% of the world's languages or more. I mean, 50% of the world's languages are verb final. Those tend to be postpositions. Those markers, they have the same kinds of markers as we do in English, but they put them after. So they put them first. The markers come first. So you say, instead of talk about a book, you say a book about, the opposite order there. In Japanese or in Hindi, you do the opposite, and the talk comes at the end. So the verb will come at the end as well. So instead of Mary kicked the ball, it's Mary ball kicked, and then if it's Mary kicked the ball to John, it's John to. The marker there, the preposition, it's a postposition in these languages. And so the interesting thing, fascinating thing to me is that within a language, this order aligns. It's harmonic. And so if it's one or the other, if it's either verb initial or verb final, but then you'll have prepositions, prepositions, or postpositions. And so that's across the languages that we can look at. We've got around 1,000 languages. There's around 7,000 languages around on the earth right now. But we have information about, say, word order on around 1,000 of those, pretty decent amount of information. And for those 1,000, which we know about 95% fit that pattern. So they will have either verb, it's about half and half, or half are verb initial, like English, and half are verb final, like Japanese.
So just to clarify, verb initial is subject, verb, object.
That's correct.
Verb final is still subject, object, verb.
That's correct. Yeah, the subject is generally first.
That's so fascinating. I ate an apple, or I apple ate.
Yes.
Okay. And it's fascinating that there's a pretty even division in the world amongst those 45%.
Yeah, it's pretty.
So a 50-50 split.
And those two are the most common by far. Those two word orders, the subject tends to be first. There's so many interesting things, but these things are, the thing I find so fascinating is there are these generalizations within and across a language. And not only those are and there's actually a simple explanation, I think, for a lot of that. And that is you're trying to minimize dependencies between words. That's basically the story, I think, behind a lot of why word order looks the way it is we're always connecting. What is the thing I'm telling you? I'm talking to you in sentences. You're talking to me in sentences. These are sequences of words which are connected, and the connections are dependencies between the words. And it turns out that what we're trying to do in a language is actually minimize those dependency links. It's easier for me to say things if the words that are connecting for their meaning are close together. It's easier for you in understanding if that's also true. If they're far away, it's hard to produce that, and it's hard for you to understand. And the languages of the world, within a language and across languages, fit that generalization, which is, so it turns out that having verbs initial and then having prepositions ends up making dependencies shorter, and having verbs final and having postpositions ends up making dependencies shorter than if you cross them. If you cross them, you just end up, it's possible. You can do it.
You mean within a language?
Within a language, you can do it. It just ends up with longer dependencies than if you didn't. And so languages tend to go that way. They tend
so
to
the rules regarding that language
harmonic. So it was
are a little
observed
shorter.
ago
Like there's less ifs,
without the explanation,
ands, or
by,
buts,
a guy
extra
called Joseph
rules
Greenberg, who's
to the language. If you
famous typologist
if
from
you
Stanford, he observed a lot of generalizations about how word order
if you
works.
use them that
And
way,
these are some of the
within one of the
harmonic
two
generalizations that he
primary
observed.
ways of doing it.
Harmonic generalizations about word order. There's so many things I want to ask
Okay,
you.
good.
Okay, let me just sometimes basics. You mentioned dependencies a few times.
Yeah.
What do you mean by dependencies?
Well, what I mean is in language, there's kind of three components to the structure of language. One is the sounds. So cat is k, a, and t in English. I'm not talking about that part. Then there's two meaning parts, and those are the words. And you were talking about meaning earlier. So words have a form, and they have a meaning associated with them. And so cat is a full form in English, and it has a meaning associated with whatever a cat is. And then the combinations of words, that's what I'll call grammar or syntax. And that's like when I have a combination like the cat or two cats. Okay, so where I take two different words there and put them together, and I get a compositional meaning from putting those two different words together. And so that's the syntax. And in any sentence or utterance, whatever I'm talking to you, you're talking to me, we have a bunch of words, and we're putting them together in a sequence. It turns out they are connected so that every word is connected to just one other word in that sentence. And so you end up with what's called technically a tree. It's a tree structure. So where there's a root of that utterance of that sentence, and then there's a bunch of dependents, like branches from that root.
Those
that
things
go down
don't depend on
to
all the other
words.
things,
The words
only on
are the
one other
leaves
thing.
in this metaphor for a tree.
So a tree is also sort of a mathematical construct.
Yeah,
So
it's a graph theoretical thing. Exactly.
Graph theory thing.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating that you can break down a sentence into a tree, and then every word is hanging on to another. It's depending on it.
That's right. And everyone agrees on that. So all linguists will agree with that.
This is not a controversial.
That is not controversial.
There's nobody sitting here
I do not think so.
mad at you.
I don't think so.
Okay. There's no linguist sitting there mad at this.
No, I think in every language, I think everyone agrees that all sentences are trees at some level.
Can I pause on that?
Sure.
Because it's to me just as
Sentences are trees.
layman,
The meaning of it depends on the web of what's going on
you
within
can
it.
break down sentences in all languages,
All languages, I think.
into a tree.
I think so.
That's weird.
I've never heard of
That's
anyone
weird.
disagreeing with that.
That's weird.
The details of the trees are what people disagree about.
Well, okay. So what's at the root of a tree? How do you construct? How hard is it? What is the process of constructing a tree from a sentence?
Well, this is where, depending on what there's different theoretical notions. I'm going to say the simplest thing, dependency grammar. It's like a bunch of people invented this. Tenier was the first French guy back in, the paper was published in 1959, but he was working on the 30s and stuff. So, and it goes back to, philologist Panini was doing this in ancient
Let me do this for
India, okay? And so, doing something like this, the simplest thing we can think of is that there's just connections between the words to make the utterance. And so let's just say I have like two dogs entered a room. Okay, here's a sentence. And so we're connecting two and dogs together. That's like there's some dependency between those words to make some bigger meaning. And then we're connecting dogs now to entered, right? And we connect a room somehow to entered. And so I'm going to connect to room and then room back to entered. That's the tree. The root is entered. That's the thing is like an entering event. That's what we're saying here. And the subject, which is whatever that dog is two dogs it was. And the connection goes back to dogs, which goes back to then that goes back to two. That's my tree. It starts at entered, goes to dogs, down to two. And on the other side, after the verb, the object, it goes to room, and then that goes back to the determiner or article, whatever we want to call that word. So there's a bunch of categories of words here we're noticing. So there are verbs. Those are these things that typically mark, they refer to events and states in the world. And they're nouns, which typically refer to people, places, and things is what people say, but they can refer to they can refer to events themselves as well. They're marked by, how they get used. The category, the part of speech of a word is how it gets used in language. It's like that's how you decide what the category of a word is, not by the meaning, but how it gets used.
How it's used.
Yeah.
What's usually the root? Is it going to be the verb that defines the event?
Usually, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if I don't say a verb, then there won't be a verb, and so it'll be something else.
What if you're messing? Are we talking about language that's like correct language? What if you're doing poetry and messing with stuff? Is it then rules go out the window, right? Then it's
No.
you're still
No. You're constrained by whatever language you're dealing with. Probably you have other constraints in poetry, such that you're like usually in poetry there's multiple constraints that you want to usually convey multiple meanings is the idea, and maybe you have like a rhythm or a rhyming structure as well. And depending on but you usually are constrained by the rules of your language for the most part, and so you don't violate those too much. You can violate them somewhat, but not too much. So it has to be recognizable as your language. Like in English, I can't say dogs two entered room I mean, I meant that, two dogs entered a room, and I can't mess with the order of the articles, articles and the nouns. You just can't do that. In some languages, you can mess around with
Dogs
the order
two entered a room
of words much more. I mean, you speak Russian.
What?
Russian has a much freer word order than English.
What kind of
in
game
fact,
you trying to play?
Move around words in, I told you that English has the subject, verb, object, word order. So does Russian. But Russian
Subject,
is
verb,
much freer
object.
than English, and so you can actually mess around with the word order.
I
So probably
saw
Russian
a dog.
poetry is going to be quite different from English poetry because the word order is much less constrained.
Yeah, there's a much more extensive culture.
See if I can
of
do a
poetry throughout the history
2955.
of the last 100 years in Russia.
And I won.
And I always wondered why that is, but it seems that there's more flexibility in the way the language is used. There's more. You're morphing the language easier by altering the words, altering the order of the words, messing with it.
Well, you can just mess with different things in each language. And so in Russian, you have case markers, right, on the end, there's these endings on the nouns, which tell you how it connects, each noun connects to the verb, right? We don't have that in English. And so when I say Mary kissed John, I don't know who the agent or the patient is except by the order of the words, right? In Russian, you actually have a marker
the
on
agent
end
or the
if you're using
patient.
a
That's
Russian name, and
interesting.
each of those names, you'll also say, is it, agent, it'll be the, nominative, which is marking the
agent or the
subject,
patient, the person who did it, or the person who
and you could
received
put
it.
them in the reverse
The
order.
kiss.
You could put accusative first. You could put subject. You could put the patient first, and then the verb, and then the subject, and that would be a perfectly good Russian sentence, and it would still mean Mary. I could say John kissed Mary, meaning Mary kissed John, as long as I use the case markers in the right way. You can't do that in English. And so
I love the terminology.
You could mean the agent came last.
And the other ones you used,
well,
those are sort of
that's
linguistic
crazy.
terms, correct?
those are
You have to
for like
clarify it.
kind of meaning. Those are meaning. And subject and object are generally used for position.
Keep in mind,
So
guys,
subject
all this
just
is a
like the thing
preface
that comes before
to
the
talking
verb,
about
and the
large
object is what
language
comes
models.
after the
That's
verb.
whenever the
agent
real
is kinda
fun
like
begins.
the thing doing it. That's kind of what that
Guaranteed.
means, right? The subject is often the person doing the action, right? The thing. So yeah.
Okay, this is fascinating. So how hard is it to form a tree in general? Is there a procedure to it? Like if you look at different languages, is it supposed to be a very natural, like is it automatable, or is there some human genius involved in
I think it's pretty automatable at this point. People can figure out the words are. They can figure out the morphemes, which are technically morphemes are the minimal meaning units within a language. Okay, and so when you say eats or drinks, it actually has two morphemes in English. There's the root, which is the verb, and then there's some ending on it which tells you, that's this third person singular.
Can you say what morphemes are?
Morphemes are just the minimal meaning units within a language, and then a word is just kind of the things we put spaces between in English, and they have a little bit more. They have the morphology as well. They have the endings, this inflectional morphology on the
We
endings.
got 2 hours
on
to
the
build this
They
entrance.
modify something about the word that
Yeah.
adds additional meaning.
They tell you, yeah. And so we have a little bit of that in English, very little. You have much more in Russian, for instance, and but we have a little bit in English, and so we have a little on the nouns. You can say it's either singular or plural, and you can say same thing for verbs, like simple past tense, for example. So notice in English we say drinks. He drinks, but everyone else is I drink, you drink, we drink. It's unmarked in a way. And then, but in the past tense, it's just drank. For everyone, there's no morphology at all for past tense. There is morphology. It's marking past tense, but it's it's an irregular now. So we don't even, drink to drank. It's not even a regular word. So
Drank.
in most verbs,
It could
many
mean
verbs, there's an ed
They
we
did.
kind of add. So walk to walk,
Or I
we add
did.
that to say it's the past tense. That I just happened to choose an irregular because it's a high frequency word, and the high frequency words tend to have irregulars in English. For
What's an irregular? That's
irregular, it's just there isn't a rule. So drink to drank is an irregular,
drank. Okay.
as
Versus
opposed to
walked.
walked, talked,
Yeah.
talked.
And there's a lot of irregulars in English.
There's a lot of irregulars in English. The frequent ones, the common words, tend to be irregular. There's many more low frequency words,
Yeah.
and those tend to be those are regular ones.
The evolution of the irregulars are fascinating because it's essentially slang that's sticky because you're breaking the rules, and then everybody uses it and doesn't follow the rules.
Yeah.
And they say screw it to the rules.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. So you said it morphemes, lots of
Yeah.
questions. So
Yeah.
morphology is what, the study of morphemes?
Morphology is the connections between the morphemes onto the roots. The roots. So in English, we mostly have suffixes. We have endings on the words, not very much, but a little bit. And as opposed to prefixes, some words, depending on your language, can have, mostly prefixes, mostly suffixes, or mostly or both. And then even languages, several languages have things called infixes, where you have some kind of a general form for the root, and you put stuff in the middle. You change the vowels.
That's
stuff
fascinating.
Like that.
That is fascinating. So wait, so in general, there's what, 2 morphemes per word? Usually 1 or 2 or 3?
Well, in English, it's 1 or 2. In English, it tends to be 1 or 2. There can be more. In other languages, a language like Finnish, which has a very elaborate morphology, there may be 10 morphemes on the end of a root.
Boy.
Okay, and so there may be millions of forms of a given word. Okay.
Okay, so I'll ask the same question over and over, but
Oh, it's not the duty of the soldiers.
how does sometimes to understand things like morphemes, it's nice to just ask the question, how does these kinds of things evolve? So you have a great book studying sort of the how the cognitive processing, how language used for communication, so the mathematical notion of how effective a language is for communication, what role that plays in the evolution of language. But just high level, like how does a language evolve with where English has 2 morphemes or 1 or 2 morphemes per word, and then Finnish has infinity per word? So how does that happen?
Morphemes, different like ways that you can use it.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. It's like, why do languages have more morphology versus less morphology?
Yeah.
And I don't think we know the answer to this. I think there's just like a lot of good solutions to the problem of communication. So I believe, as you hinted, that language is an invented system by humans for communicating their ideas. And I think it comes down to we label the things we want to talk about. Those are the morphemes and words. Those are the things we want to talk about in the world, and we invent those things, and then we put them together in ways that are easy for us to convey, to process. But that's like a naive view, and I think it's probably right. Right? It's naive and probably right.
Well, I don't know if it's naive. I think it's simple.
Simple, yeah.
I think naive is naive is an
Right.
indication that it's incorrect somehow. It's a trivial, too simple. I think it could very well be correct.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how sticky it feels like 2 people got together. It just feels like once you figure out certain aspects of a language, that just becomes sticky, and the tribe forms around that language. Maybe the tribe forms first, and then the language evolves, and then you just kind of agree and you stick to whatever that is.
I mean, these are very interesting questions. We don't know
Yeah.
really about how even words get invented very much. We don't really, assuming they get invented, we don't really know how that process works and how these things evolve. What we have is kind of a current picture of a few thousand languages, a few thousand instances. We don't have any pictures of really how these things are evolving, really. And then the evolution is massively.
We got to work with what we got. Because the language was invented before it was written down,
right? So as soon as one group runs into another, we are smart. Humans are smart, and they take on whatever is useful in the other group. And so any kind of contrast which you're talking about, which I find useful, I'm gonna start using as well. So I worked a little bit in specific areas of words, in number words and in color words. And in color words, so we have in English, we have around 11 words that everyone knows for colors. and many more if you happen to be interested in color for some reason or other. If you're a fashion designer or an artist or something, you may have many, many more words. But we can see millions. Like if you have normal color vision, normal trichromatic color vision, you can see millions of distinctions in color. So we don't have millions of words. The most efficient, so the most detailed color vocabulary would have over 1 million terms to distinguish all the different colors that we can see. But of course, we don't have that. So it's kind of useful for English to have evolved in some way such that there's 11 terms that people find useful to talk about. Black, white, red, blue, green, yellow, purple, gray, pink, and I probably missed something there. Anyway, there's 11 that everyone knows.
Yeah.
And depending on but you go to different cultures, especially the non-industrialized cultures, and there'll be many fewer. So some cultures will have only 2. Believe it or not, that the Danai in Papua New Guinea have only 2 labels that the group uses for color. And those are roughly black and white. They are very, very dark and very, very light, which are roughly black and white. And you might think, oh, they're dividing the whole color space into light and dark or something, and that's not really true. They mostly just only label the black and the white things. They just don't talk about the colors for the other ones. And so, and then there's other groups. I've worked with a group called the Chimani down in Bolivia in South America, and they have 3 words that everyone knows, but there's a few others that several people that many people know. And so they have it's kind of depending on how you count, between 3 and 7 words that the group knows. Okay. And again, they're black and white. Everyone knows those. And red is, like that tends to be the 3rd word that everyone that cultures bring in.
Nice.
If there's a word, it's always red, the 3rd one. And then after that, it's kind of all bets are off about what they bring in. And so after that, they bring in sort of a big blue-green GRU. They have one for that. And then they have, different people have different words that they'll use for other parts of the space. And so anyway, it's probably related to what they want to talk, not what they see, because they see the same colors as we see. So it's not like they have a weak, a low color palette in the things they're looking at. They're looking at a lot of beautiful scenery, a lot of different colored flowers and berries and things, and so there's lots of things of very bright colors, but they just don't label the color in those cases. And the reason, probably, we don't know this, but we think probably what's going on here is that why you label something is you need to talk to someone else about it. And why do I need to talk about a color? Well, if I have 2 things which are identical, and I want you to give me the one that's different, and the only way it varies is color, then I invent a word which tells you, this is the one I want. So I want the red sweater off the rack, not the green sweater, right? There's 2, and so those things will be identical, because these are things we made and they're dyed, and there's nothing different about them. And so in industrialized society, we have, everything we've got is pretty much arbitrarily colored. But if you go to a non-industrialized group, that's not true. And so they don't, it's not like they're not interested in color. If you bring bright colored things to them, they like them just like we like them. Bright colors are great. They're beautiful. But they just don't need to talk about them. They don't have.
So probably color words is a good example of how language evolves from sort of function. When you need to communicate the use of something,
I think so.
Then you kind of invent different variations, and basically you can imagine that the evolution of a language has to do with what the early tribe's doing, like what they want, what kind of problems are facing them, and they're quickly figuring out how to efficiently communicate the solution to those problems, whether it's aesthetic or functional, all that kind of stuff, running away from a mammoth or whatever. But it's so I think what you're pointing to is that we don't have data on the evolution of language, because many languages are formed a long time ago, so you don't get the chatter.
We have a little bit of like Old English to modern English because there was a writing system, and we can see how Old English looked. So the word order changed, for instance, in Old English to Middle English to modern English, and so we could see things like that. But most languages don't even have a writing system. So of the 7,000, only a small subset of those have a writing system, and even if they have a writing system, it's not a very modern writing system, and so they don't have it. So we just basically have for Mandarin, for Chinese, we have a lot of evidence from for a long time, and for English, and not for much else. Not for German a little bit, but not for a whole lot of like long-term language evolution. We don't have a lot.
Well,
we
you
just have snapshots is what we've got of current languages.
Yeah, you get an inkling of that from the rapid communication on certain platforms, like on Reddit.
Oh, yeah.
There's different communities,
Mhm.
and they'll come up with different slang. Usually, from my perspective, driven by a little bit of humor, or maybe mockery or whatever. It's just talking shit in different kinds of ways, and you could see the evolution of language there, because I think a lot of things on the internet, you don't want to be the boring mainstream, so you like want to deviate from the proper way of talking.
Mhm.
And so you get a lot of deviation, like rapid deviation. Then when communities collide, you get like, just like you said, humans adapt to it, and you can see it through the lens of humor. I mean, it's very difficult to study, but you can imagine like 100 years from now, if there's a new language born, for example, we'll get really high resolution data.
I mean, English is changing. English changes all the time. All languages change all the time. So, there's a famous result about the Queen's English. So if you look at the Queen's vowels, the Queen's English is supposed to be, originally the proper way for the talk was sort of defined by however the Queen talked, or the King, whoever was in charge. And so if you look at how her vowels changed from when she first became queen in 1952 or 53, when she was coronated. That's Queen Elizabeth, who died recently, of course, until 50 years later, her vowels changed. Her vowels shifted a lot, and so that even in the sounds of British English, in her the way she was talking was changing. The vowels were changing slightly. So that's just in the sounds. There's change. I don't know what's I'm interested. We're all interested in what's driving any of these changes. The word order of English changed a lot over 1,000 years, right? So it used to look like German. It used to be a verb final language with case marking, and it shifted to a verb medial language. A lot of contact with French, and it became a verb medial language with no case marking, and so it became this verb initially thing. So that's
evolving.
It totally evolved, and so it may very well. I mean, it doesn't evolve maybe very much in 20 years is maybe what you're talking about. But over 50 and 100 years, things change a lot, I think.
We'll now have good data on it, which is great.
That's for sure. Yeah.
Can you talk to what is syntax and what is grammar? So you wrote a book on syntax.
I did. You were asking me before about how do I figure out what a dependency structure is? And I'd say the dependency structures aren't that hard to generally. I think there's a lot of agreement of what they are for almost any sentence in most languages. I think people will agree on a lot of that. There are other parameters in the mix such that some people think there's a more complicated grammar than just a dependency structure. And so, like Noam Chomsky, he's the most famous linguist ever, and he is famous for proposing a slightly more complicated syntax. And so he invented phrase structure grammar. So he's well known for many, many things, but in the 50s and in the early 60s, but late 50s, he was basically figuring out what's called formal language theory. Mm-hmm. So, and he figured out sort of a framework for figuring out how complicated language, a certain type of language might be, so-called phrase structure grammars of language might be. And so his idea was that maybe we can think about the complexity of a language by how complicated the rules are, okay? And the rules will look like this. They will have a left-hand side and we'll have a right-hand side. Mm-hmm. Something on the left-hand side will expand to the thing on the right-hand side. So we'll start with an S, which is like the root, which is a sentence, okay? And then we're going to expand to things like a noun phrase and a verb phrase is what he would say, for instance, okay? An S goes to an NP and a VP is a kind of a phrase structure rule. And we figure out what an NP is. An NP is a determiner and a noun, for instance, and a verb phrase is something else, is a verb and another noun phrase and another NP, for instance. Those are the rules of a very simple phrase structure, okay? And so he proposed phrase structure grammar.
Try type-free and gentle.
Oh?
No irritating residues, no dyes, no perfumes.
Really?
When you're looking for a detergent...
Is that what you want? Guys, we're building this ant colony up. It's a tricky one.
He actually figured out that, well, depending on the formalization of those grammars, you might get more complicated or less complicated languages. And so he said, well, these are things called, context-free languages that rule. That he thought, human languages tend to be what he calls context-free languages. But there are simpler languages, which are so-called regular languages, and they have a more constrained form to the rules of the phrase structure of these particular rules. So he basically discovered and kind of invented ways to describe
Said Silver
the
Weekly
language,
Pass.
and those are phrase
Worth it if you wanna
structure,
level up really fast.
a human language. And he was mostly interested in English initially in his work in the 50s.
So quick questions around all this. So formal language theory is the big field of just studying language formally.
Yes, and it doesn't have to be human language there. We can have computer languages, any kind of system which is generating some set of expressions in a language, and those could be like the statements in a computer language, for example. So it could be that, or it could be human language.
So technically, you can study programming languages.
Yes, and have been heavily studied using this formalism. There's a big field of programming languages within the formal language.
Okay. And then phrase structure grammar is this idea that you can break down language into this SNP-VP like type of thing.
It's a particular formalism for describing language. Okay, so and Chomsky was the first one. He's the one who figured that stuff out back in the 50s. But that's equivalent, actually. The context-free grammar is kind of equivalent in the sense that it generates the same sentences as a dependency grammar would. As the dependency grammar is a little simpler in some way. You just have a root, and it goes like, we don't have any of these. The rules are implicit, I guess. We just have connections between words. The phrase structure grammar is kind of a different way to think about the dependency grammar.
So,
it's slightly more complicated, but it's kind of the same in some ways.
So to clarify, dependency grammar is the framework under which you see language, and you make the case that this is a good way to describe language.
That's correct.
And Noam Chomsky is watching this, is very upset right now. So let's I'm just kidding. But what's the difference between where's the place of disagreement between phrase structure grammar and dependency grammar?
They're very close. So phrase structure grammar and dependency grammar aren't that far apart. I like dependency grammar because it's more perspicuous, it's more transparent about representing the connections between the words. It's just a little harder to see in phrase structure grammar. The place where Chomsky sort of devolved or went off from this is he also thought there was something called movement. Okay, and and that's where we disagree. Okay, that's the place where I would say we disagree. And I mean, maybe we'll get into that later. But the idea is, if you want to, do you want me to explain that now?
I would love. Can you explain movement?
Movement. Okay, so
you're saying so many interesting things.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the movement is Chomsky basically sees English. And he says, okay, I said, we had that sentence earlier, like it was like 2 dogs entered the room. Let's change it a little bit, say 2 dogs will enter the room. And he notices that, hey, English, if I want to make a question, a yes-no question from that same sentence, I say, instead of 2 dogs will enter the room, I say, will 2 dogs enter the room? Okay, there's a different way to say the same idea. And it's like, well, the auxiliary verb, that will thing,
but
it's at the front as opposed to in the middle. Okay. And he looked, if you look at English, you see that that's true for all those modal verbs and for other kinds of auxiliary verbs in English. You always do that. You always put an auxiliary verb at the front. And when he saw that, so, if I say, I can win this bet, can I win this bet, right? So I move a can to the front. So actually, that's a theory. I just gave you a theory there. He talks about it as movement. That word in he thinks the declarative is the root, is the sort of default way to think about the sentence, and you move the auxiliary verb to the front. That's a movement theory. Okay, he said, and he just thought that was just so obvious that it must be true. That there's nothing more to say about that. That this is how auxiliary verbs work in English. There's a movement rule, such that to get from the declarative to the interrogative, you're moving the auxiliary to the front. And it's a little more complicated as soon as you go to simple present and simple past, because, if I say, John slept, you have to say, did John sleep, not slept John, right? And so you have to somehow get an auxiliary verb, and I guess underlyingly, it's like, slept is, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's his idea. There's a movement, okay? And so a different way to think about that isn't, I mean, then he ended up showing later. So he proposed this theory of grammar, which has movement. And there's other places where he thought there's movement, not just auxiliary verbs, but things like the passive in English and things like questions, WH questions, a bunch of places where he thought there's also movement going on. And in each one of those, he thinks there's words, well, phrases and words are moving around from one structure to another, which he called deep structure to surface structure. I mean, there's like two different structures in his theory. Okay, there's a different way to think about this, which is there's no movement at all. There's a lexical copying rule such that the word will or the word can, these auxiliary verbs, they just have two forms. And one of them is the declarative and one of them is the interrogative. And you basically have the declarative one and, oh, I form the interrogative or I can form one from the other. It doesn't matter which direction you go. And I just have a new entry, which has the same meaning, which has a slightly different argument structure. Argument structure is just a fancy word for the ordering of the words. And so if I say, you know, it was the dogs, two dogs can or will enter the room. There's two forms of will. One is will declarative, and then, okay, I've got my subject to the left, it comes before me, and the verb comes after me in that one. And then the will interrogative is like, oh, I go first. Interrogative, will is first, and then I have the subject immediately after, and then the verb after that. And so you can just generate from one of those words another word with a slightly different argument structure, with different ordering.
And these are just lexical copies.
And
they're not necessarily moving from one to another.
There's no movement.
There's a romantic notion that you have like one main way to use a word, and then you could move it around.
Right.
Which is essentially what movement is implying.
Yeah, but that's the lexical copying is similar. So then then we do lexical copying for that same idea that maybe the declarative is the source and then we can copy it. And so an advantage there's multiple advantages of the lexical copying story. It's not my story. This is like Ivan Sog, linguists, a bunch of linguists have been proposing these stories as well, you know, in tandem with the movement story. Okay, you know, Ivan Sog died a while ago, but he was one of the proponents of the non-movement of the lexical copying story. And so that is that a great advantage is, well, Chomsky really famously in 1971 showed that the movement story leads to learnability problems. It leads to problems for how language is learned. It's really, really hard to figure out what the underlying structure of a language is if you have both phrase structure and movement. It's like really hard to figure out what came from what. There's like a lot of possibilities there. If you don't have that problem, the learning problem gets a lot easier.
Just say there's lexical copies.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
When we say the learning problem, do you mean like humans learning a new language?
Yeah, just learning English. So baby is lying around listening to the crib, listening to me talk, and how are they learning English?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's a 2-year-old who's learning interrogatives and stuff. Or one how are they doing that? Are they doing it from are they figuring out? Or so Chomsky said it's impossible to figure it out. Actually, he said it's actually impossible, not hard, but impossible. Mm-hmm. And therefore, that's where universal grammar comes from. Is that it has to be built in. And so what they're learning is that there's some built-in movement is built in his story, is absolutely part of your language module, and then you're just setting parameters. You're set depending on English is just sort of a variant of the universal grammar, and you're figuring out which orders does English do these things. That's the non-movement story doesn't have this. It's like much more bottom up. You're learning rules. You're learning rules one by one, and there's this word is connected to that word. A great advantage. Another advantage, it's learnable. Another advantage of it is that it predicts that not all auxiliaries might move. Like it might depend on the word, depending on whether you and that turns out to be true. So there's words that don't really work as auxiliary. They work in declarative and not in interrogative. So I can say, I'll give you the opposite first. If I can say, "Aren't I invited to the party?" Okay, and that's an interrogative form. But it's not from "I aren't invited to the party." There is no "I aren't," right? So that's interrogative only, and then we also have forms like ought. I ought to do this. And I guess some old British people can say exactly. It doesn't sound right, does it? For me, it sounds ridiculous. I don't even think ought is great, but I mean, I totally recognize I ought to. It's not too bad actually. I can say I ought to do this. That sounds pretty good. Yeah.
If I'm trying to sound sophisticated, maybe.
I don't know. It just sounds completely out to me.
Ought I?
Yeah. Anyway, it's so there are variants here. And a lot of these words just work in one versus the other. And that's like fine under the lexical copying story. It's like, well, you just learn the usage. Whatever the usage is what you do with this word. But it doesn't, it's a little bit harder in the movement story. The movement story, like that's an advantage, I think, of lexical copying. In all these different places, there's all these usage variants, which make the movement story a little bit harder to work.
So one of the main divisions here is the movement story versus the lexical copy story.
That's
that
right.
has to do about the auxiliary words and so on. But if you
saw that?
rewind to the phrase
There we
structure
go.
grammar
Yeah.
versus dependency grammar.
Those are equivalent in some sense in that for any dependency grammar, I can generate a phrase structure grammar which generates exactly the same sentences. I just like the dependency grammar formalism
Kelsey
because
grammar.
it makes something really salient, which is the lengths of dependencies between words, which isn't so obvious in the phrase structure. In the phrase structure, it's just kind of hard to see. It's in there. It's just very it's opaque.
Technically, I think phrase structure grammar is mappable to dependency grammar.
And vice versa.
And vice versa.
Yeah,
but there's like
equivalent.
these like little labels, S and P, V, P.
Yeah. For a particular dependency grammar, you can make a phrase structure grammar which generates exactly those same sentences and vice versa. But there are many phrase structure grammars which you can't really make a dependency grammar. I mean, you can do a lot more in a phrase structure grammar, but you get many more of these extra nodes, basically. You can have more structure in there. And some people like that, and maybe there's value to that. I don't like it.
Well, for you, so we should clarify. So dependency grammar, it's just one word depends on only one other word, and you form these trees, and that makes it really puts priority on those dependencies, just like as a tree that you can then measure the distance of the dependency from one word to the other. They can then map to the cognitive processing of these sentences, how easy it is to understand, and all that kind of stuff. So it just puts the focus on just like the mathematical distance of dependence between words. So like it's just a different focus.
Absolutely.
Just continue on the thread of Chomsky because it's really interesting. Because as you're discussing disagreement, to the degree there's disagreement, you're also telling the history of the study of language, which is really awesome. So you mentioned context-free versus regular. Does that distinction come into play for dependency grammars?
No, not at all. I mean, regular languages are too simple for human languages. It's a part of the hierarchy, but human languages are in the phrase structure world are they're at least context free, maybe a little bit harder than that. But so there's something called context sensitive as well, where you can have.
It depends on what's going on.
This is just the formal language description.
I know that from Conker's Bad Fur Day. What a classic.
This is like a bunch of like formal language theory we're doing here. But
I love it.
Okay, so you have a left-hand side category, and you're expanding to anything on the right. That's a context-free. So like the idea is that category on the left expands independent of context to those things, whatever there are on the right. It doesn't matter what. And a context-sensitive says, okay, I actually have more than one thing on the left. I can tell you only in this context, maybe you have like a left and a right context, or just a left context or a right context. I have two or more stuff on the left, tells you how to expand those things in that way. Okay, so it's context sensitive. A regular language is just more constrained, and so it doesn't allow anything on the right. It allows basically it's one very complicated rule is kind of what a regular language is. And so it doesn't have any long distance dependencies. It doesn't allow recursion, for instance. There's no recursion. Recursion is where which is human languages have recursion. They have embedding, and you can't. Well, it doesn't allow center embedded recursion, which human languages have, which is what
Center embedded
We're
recursion.
gonna
So
get
within
to
a
that.
sentence? Within a
Yeah,
sentence.
yeah, within a sentence. So here we're going to get to that. But the formal language stuff is a little aside. Chomsky wasn't proposing it for human languages even. He was just pointing out that human languages are context free. And then he was most for human, because that was kind of stuff we did for formal languages. And what he was most interested in was human language. And that's like the movement is where we.
Anybody notice that this little guy right here
where he sort of set off
is like
on the, I would say,
freaking
a very
out
interesting.
every time the
But
bugs
wrong
come
foot.
out?
It was kind of interesting. It's a very, I agree. It's
Why
kind
is
of a
that?
very interesting history. So there's this. So he proposed this multiple theories in 57 and then 65. They all have this framework though. It was phrase structure plus movement. Different versions of the phrase structure and the movement in the 57. These are the most famous original bits of Chomsky's work. And then in 71 is when he figured out that those lead to learning problems. That there's cases where a kid could never figure out which rule, which set of rules was intended. And then he said, well, that means it's innate. It's kind of interesting. He just really thought the movement was just so obviously true that he couldn't. He didn't even entertain giving it up. It's just obvious. That's obviously right. And it was later where people figured out that there's all these like subtle ways in which things which look like generalizations aren't generalizations, and they across the category they're word specific, and they kind of work, but they don't work across various other words in the category, and so it's easier to just think of these things as lexical copies. And I think he was very obsessed. I don't know. I'm just guessing that he really wanted this story to be simple in some sense, and language is a little more complicated in some sense. He didn't like words. He never talked about words. He likes to talk about combinations of words, and words are, look up the dictionary.
Words.
There's 50 senses for a common word, right? The word take will have 30 or 40 senses in it. So there'll be many different senses for common words, and he just doesn't think about that. Or doesn't think that's language. I think he doesn't think that's language. He thinks that words are distinct from combinations of words. I think
I don't need a yellow.
If you look at my brain in the scanner while I'm listening to a language I understand, and you compare, I can localize my language network in a few minutes, in like 15 minutes. And what you do is I listen to a language I know, I listen to, maybe some language I don't know, or I listen to muffled speech, or I read sentences, and I read non-words. Like I can do anything like this, anything that's sort of really like English and anything that's not very like English. So I've got something like it and not, and I got to control.
I don't need a red.
And the voxels, which is just, the 3D pixels in my brain that are responding most is a language area. And that's this left lateralized area in my head. And wherever I look in that network, if you look for the combinations versus the words, it's everywhere. It's the same.
That's fascinating.
And so it's like hard to find. There are no areas that we know. I mean, it's a little overstated right now. At this point, the technology.
I said I don't
isn't
need
great.
yellow.
It's not bad,
I
but
lied.
we have the best way to figure out what's going on in my brain when I'm listening or reading language is to use fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and
I don't
that's a
need
very
green.
good localization method. So I can figure out where exactly these signals are coming from, pretty, down to, millimeters, cubic millimeters or smaller. Okay, very small.
Don't
We can
need
figure
red.
those out very well. The problem is the when. Okay, it's measuring oxygen.
Don't
Okay, and oxygen
need
takes
red.
a little while to get to those cells, so it takes on the order of seconds. So I talk fast. I probably listen fast, and I can probably understand things really
green.
fast. So a lot of stuff happens in 2 seconds, and so to say that we know what's going on, that the words right now in that network, our best guess is that whole network is doing something similar, but maybe different parts of that network are doing different things. And that's probably the case. We just don't have very good methods to figure that out right at this moment. And so,
Since we're kind of talking about the history of the study of language, what other interesting disagreements, and you're both at
So
MIT,
close.
or were for a long time, what kind of interesting disagreements there, tension of ideas are there between you and Noam Chomsky? And we should say that Noam was in the linguistics department, and you're, I guess for a time were affiliated there, but primarily brain and cognitive science department, which is another way of studying language, and you've been talking about fMRI. So like, is there something else
What up, Faye?
interesting to
Welcome.
bring to the surface about the disagreement
How's it
between
going?
the two of you, or other people in the
yeah,
discipline?
I mean, I've been at MIT for 31 years, since 1993, and Chomsky's been there much longer. So I met him. I knew him. I met when I first got there, I guess, and we would interact every now and then.
I don't want to buy it.
So I'd say our biggest difference is our methods, and so that's the biggest difference between me and Noam, is that I gather data from people. I do experiments with people, and I gather corpus data. Whatever corpus data is available, and we do
I'll buy it.
quantitative
Since you're
methods
making me,
to
or since you
evaluate
won't get rid of the red thing.
any kind of hypothesis we have.
I need that gone.
He just doesn't do that.
Appreciate you
know,
stopping by.
He has never
Thanks, Faye.
once been
If you're
associated
bored
with any
and want to pick up a new game, a new mobile game, definitely check out the
intuitions. So I just don't think
the
that's
QR
way
code
to
over
do
there.
things.
Use that link. Download the game. Get a level 5 queen and perform a raid. Helps me out. If you decide to buy the silver pass for $5,
some of the linguists,
that's
depending on
awesome
what
too.
you do, more
It's going well.
speech-oriented,
I'm streaming Ant Legion for a few hours because I have a campaign going on where if people download the game and complete some objectives, they're gonna help me out. They're gonna pay me. And just listen to some Lex Fridman at the same time. You know, it doesn't get better. Learning about large language models, linguistics, and how languages are made. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
What are you up to?
I'm a psychologist, so I would say we're in psychology.
But if you want to see how the
know,
game
in
plays,
brain cognitive
that's
science
it over on
is
that side.
MIT's
I'm pretty
old
far in,
psychology
pretty deep in.
department.
I've been playing since
It
last
was the
week,
psychology
so
department up until
my
1985,
progress
and
is
then
going to be a
became
little
the brain
slower than if you
cognitive
played.
science
Like, you'd
department.
probably be able to
And
catch
so
up to me in like
I mean, my training isn't
an hour.
I mean, my training is
So,
math, computer science, but
it just
I'm a
gets slower and
psychologist.
slower.
I mean, I
It's
don't
tricky.
know what I am.
So David,
What are you up to?
Well,
Yeah.
You are.
I am what I am, but I'm happy to
Many
be called a
things.
linguist. I'm happy to be called a computer scientist. I'm happy to be called a psychologist. Any of those things.
But
are
in the
fine.
actual, like how that manifests itself outside of the methodology is like these differences, these subtle differences.
Queen level
about
9.
The movement story versus the lexical copy story.
Yeah,
and
those are
kind of-
theories,
those are
right?
theories.
So the theories are. But I think the reason we differ in part is because of how we evaluate the theories. And so I evaluate
Got
theories
it.
quantitatively, and
Yes. 8 hours?
Got it. Okay, well let's explore the
Golly.
theories that you explore in your book. Let's
Use all
return
this.
to this dependency grammar.
3 hours right there.
framework of looking at language. What's a good
Laying in bed sick?
justification why the dependency grammar framework is a good
About to
way
grab
to
some
explain
Kirby?
language?
What you
your
sick
intuition?
with?
So
Sorry to hear that. I hope you
the
feel
reason
better.
I like dependency grammar, as
Getting
I
some of that chili.
said before,
soup.
is that it's very transparent.
Kirby Lane's a
about
good
its
choice.
Representation of distance between words. So
Good
it's
choice.
All it is you've got a bunch of words. You're connecting them together to make a sentence, and
Dark cavern,
really
claimable.
neat insight, which turns out to be true, is that the further apart the pair of words are that you're connecting, the harder it is to do the production,
Oh.
the harder it is to do the comprehension. It's harder to produce, it's harder to understand when the words are far apart. When they're close together, it's easy to produce and it's easy to comprehend. Let me give you an example, okay? So
Okay, wait.
we have, in any language, we have mostly local connections between words, but they're abstract. The connections are abstract. They're between categories of words. And so you can always make things further apart if you add modification, for example, after a noun. So a noun in English comes before a verb. The subject noun comes before a verb, and then there's an object after, for example. So I can say what I said before, the dog entered the room or something like that. So I can modify dog. If I say something more about dog after it, then what I'm doing is, indirectly, I'm lengthening the dependence between dog and entered by adding more stuff to it. So I just make it explicit here. If
Everything
I say
needs a queen level 9.
the boy who the cat scratched cried. We're going to have a mean cat here.
Whew.
And so what I've got here is the boy cried. It would be a very short, simple sentence, and I just told you something about the boy, and I told you it was the boy who the cat scratched. Okay.
So the cry is connected to the boy.
Boy is
the
connected-
cry
right.
at the end
Yeah.
is connected to the
Yeah.
boy in the beginning.
Right. And so I can do that.
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
say that.
The
That's
boy
a
who the
perfectly
cat
fine English
scratched
sentence.
cried. The boy
and I
cried.
can say the
Boy
cat
cried
which
is at
the
the end.
dog chased ran away or something. Okay, I can
Yeah.
do that. But it's really but it's really hard now. I've got what I have here. I have the boy who the cat. Now let's say I try to modify cat. Okay.
I
The
received
boy
help from
who the-
Gyat Monster.
which the dog chased, scratched, ran away. God,
Oh,
that's
by the
hard,
way,
right?
Faye, if
I-
you
I
want
can-
some
I'm
hilarious
sort of just working
content
that through in
tonight,
my head, how to
me and
produce
Sally
it,
are
how to-
playing
it's really very just
Roblox,
horrendous to understand. It's not
which should
so
be really
bad.
funny.
At least I've got intonation
And
there to
a
sort
little
of
bit later,
stuff,
after
but
this
it's-
is done, I
that's
think I'm going to swap
really
over to this
complicated.
Web3 game called
Sort
Parallel.
of English in a way. I mean, that
The
follows rules
design of
English.
something that I'm working on
So what's interesting
is
about
in a
that
similar
is that,
field,
what I'm doing is nesting
and
sentences. Here I'm putting
I really
one,
like what they're doing.
and I've got
It's
a
basically
subject
like
connected to a
Hearthstone,
verb
but
there,
sci-fi.
and
Not
I'm
Hearthstone,
modifying that
Heroes
with
of New Earth,
a
but
clause,
sci-fi.
another clause,
It's
which
a free
happens to have a
NFT game.
subject and a
It's
verb
awesome.
relation. I'm trying to do that again.
It's like
on the
really
second one.
good.
And what that does is it lengthens out the dependents. Multiple dependents actually get lengthened out there. The dependencies get longer. On the outside ones get long, and even the ones in between get kind of long. And you just, so what's fascinating is that that's bad. That's really horrendous in English. But that's horrendous in any language. And so in no matter what language you look at, if you do just figure out some structure where I have some
600.
modification following some head, which is connected to some later head, and I do it again, it won't be good. It guaranteed. Like 100%, that will be uninterpretable in that language in the same way that was uninterpretable in English.
Just
So
to clarify, the distance of the dependencies is whenever the boy cried, there's a dependence between two words, and then you counting the
Something
number
about
of
tiramisu.
morphemes between them.
that's a good question. I just say words. Your words are morphemes between. We don't know that. Actually, that's a very good question. What is the distance metric? But let's just say it's words, sure.
Okay, so that, and you're saying the longer the distance of that dependence, the more, no matter the language, except legalese, it's- even legalese. Okay,
Yeah,
we'll talk
yeah,
about
yeah.
it. We'll talk about
We'll
it.
get to
Okay, okay. But that the people will be very upset that
They-
speak that language. Not upset, but they'll either not understand it, or they'll be like, "This is." They'll their brain will be working in overtime.
Yeah, they will have a hard time either producing or comprehending it. They might tell you that's not their language. You know, it's sort of their language. I mean, it's following their, like, they'll agree with each of those pieces as part of their language, but somehow that combination will be very, very difficult to produce and understand.
Is that a chicken or the egg issue here? So like, is
Well, I'm giving you an explanation.
Right.
So I mean, and then I'm giving you two kinds of explanations.
Oh.
I'm telling you that center embedding, that's nesting, those are the same. Those are synonyms for the same concept here. And the explanation for why those are always hard. Center embedding and nesting are always.
I want
hard.
to tell you this the other day, but Bayside and Finch at a concert last week that you went to. It was good?
When you do center
That
embedding,
sounds pretty
you
awesome.
always
Like,
have
that's a
long-distance
killer
connection
combo,
between
a
dependent
wild
functions.
combo.
And so that's not
like
necessarily
fun.
the right explanation. It just happens.
Any crazy moments in the concert?
And it's not really just about
Crowd
one of
surfing?
them.
What did you do?
So probably it's a pair of them. or
Sounds like a
something of
blast.
These dependents that you get long, that drives you to like be really confused.
Sounds
in
like
that
a
case.
blast.
So what the behavioral consequence there? This is kind of methods. Like, how do we get at this? You could try to do experiments to get people to produce these things. They're going to have a hard time producing them. You can try to do experiments to get them to understand them, and you see how well they understand them. Can they understand them? Another method you can do is give people partial
Oh, yeah.
materials.
Had an
and ask
amazing
them to
time.
complete them. You know those
Sweet.
embedded materials, and they'll fail.
Glad you had a
So
good
I've done that.
time.
I've done all these kinds
Sounds
of
like
things.
fun.
So, wait a minute. So central embedding, meaning like you take a normal sentence like "boy cried" and inject a bunch of crap in the middle.
Yes.
That separates the boy and the cried.
Yes.
Okay, that's central embedding, and
Huh.
nesting is
Same
Training
thing.
some more
No,
soldiers.
Nesting is the same thing. Center embedding. Those are
Yeah, that
totally
sounds cool though.
equivalent
I haven't been to a
concepts, right?
concert in a while.
Sometimes you
Oh,
want-
I didn't tell you.
got it.
I might have told you. I went.
And then,
Let's see. So Sally went and saw Drake recently. Drake, J. Cole, and
like the understanding one is like have more embedding.
gosh, who else was it?
Harder to understand, but then you have to measure.
I
the
forget who it was.
I guess.
Yeah,
But
you could. I mean, there's multiple
before
ways
she
do
went to that, like the concert got
ways, just
like pushed
how
back
good
by
it is.
months. So like in March or into February, early March, I went and saw Tool for the first time, and I'd never seen Tool before, and she had never seen Tool before. That was her first concert ever.
And
It
those,
was
like, those
wild.
give you a signal
I mean,
like,
the
like,
show
say,
was awesome.
What
People were
about the
conducted in their
completeness
seats
of
and
the
stuff. They were like
So you could give
smoking
them
and
a
stuff
partial
and doing their own
sentence,
thing, but
the book, which
it was
the
wild.
author who
They do
and
Jimmy Eat
ask you
Wednesdays
to
on the
that
first
off
Wednesday of
I
each
mean,
month
either
downtown.
say it- Yeah, but you can just
Who's that?
in front of you, and
The
you can just take
oh,
the
Diddy
question
Dog?
you want. They will Even though that one's not too
Oh, wait,
hard.
wait.
So if I say it's like the book.
I'm
like
getting
the
Diddy Dog with
book which
Bayside.
the author who I met wrote.
They do Jimmy Eat Wednesdays on the
good.
first Wednesday of
It's
each
very
month
simple
downtown.
completion
It's
for
like
that.
what
You know,
at a certain
you invite
location
that
at the venue.
completion
They just
online
play Jimmy Eat
somewhere
World.
to a crowdsourcing platform and ask people to complete that. They will.
I'd say if you're gonna see Tool, probably in the next year or two.
Like half the time,
I
maybe
feel like they're gonna
2/3 of the time. They'll
end
say- they'll
very
just leave
soon.
off one of those phrases. Even with that simple
It was awesome.
which the author,
They did a great job.
Who and they'll say
The sound was crazy. It was fun.
You need 3 verbs, right? I need 3 verbs or who.
We
I
may do
met,
something
wrote,
downtown. We'll see.
was good.
Lately
And they'll-
we've been
they'll
like
do-
just
they'll
like
say
nonstop
who was-
doing stuff.
Who was famous was good or
this
something like
this
that.
Sunday and Monday she's off.
And that'll happen about 60%.
So-
so 40%, maybe 30, they'll do it correctly.
We'll see. I think she's wanting to go to the
meaning they'll
beach.
Do with 3 verb phrases. I don't
We
know
usually
what's
have, like, a
correct or
cleanup
not,
day every week.
This is hard. It's a hard
know.
task.
Yeah, I'm struggling.
Weekly,
with it.
weekly.
Yeah, well, it's
I may
it's
be getting a
easier
new
written-
job
When you-
soon.
When you stare
Yeah,
at it.
if you look, it's a little easier.
Who
than
knows?
Listening is pretty tough because
But,
you have to. Because there's no.
Yeah,
choice
we're
of
look.
it.
I mean,
You have to
we haven't
remember the
found a
words
group
that
of
I'm
things
saying.
here
It's very hard
to
on
do
it this way.
as
You
often as I
look
think we'd
at it
like.
and figure it out. It's easier in
At
many
Swan
dimensions
Dive,
in
early
some ways,
2000s cover
depending
band. Oh,
on-
that's
it's easier
cool.
to gather
That's really
written
cool.
Data for, I mean, most sort of I work in psycholinguistics.
I
and
mean, that's right up my
psychology
alley.
and stuff, and so a lot of our work. is
If
based on
I don't
stuff
reach
because
out
it's
about
so
it
easy to
next
gather
first Wednesday,
data from people doing
remind
different
me.
kinds of
I may or may not
tasks.
go,
Some
but
tasks are
like
just
if you're gonna go
more
anyway,
complicated to
keep me in mind,
administer
and
analyze because
she and I
people
may
do
go.
weird things
We'll see.
when they speak, and it's harder to analyze what they do. But they
More on that.
they generally point to
later.
the same kinds of things.
So okay, so the
You'll
universal
get
theory
why.
of language
Yeah.
by Ted Gibson is that you can form dependency. You can form trees from any sentences, and
That's right.
you can measure the distance in some
Appreciate
way
that.
of those dependencies, and
Thanks
then
for the
you can
update,
say that,
'cause
most
we don't have enough to
languages
do
have
here
very short
right now.
dependencies.
All languages.
All languages.
All languages have short dependencies. You can actually measure that. So an ex-student of mine, this guy is at
Wow.
University of California, Irvine, Richard Futrell did a thing a bunch of years ago now, where he looked at all the languages we could look
Did you
at.
see all that
which was
stuff I
about
just got?
40 initially, and now I think there's about 60 for which there are dependency structures.
God,
so they're meaning there's got to be like
I'm
a
gonna
big
paste
text,
my link
bunch
to
of
this in
texts
the
which have been
chat so
parsed
that you
for their
can see
dependency
it.
structures, and there's about 60 of those which have been parsed that way. And for all of those, you can what he did was take any sentence in one of those languages, and you can do the dependency structure, and then start at the
If you're
root.
bored.
We're talking about dependency structures. That's pretty easy now.
Good thing you're on
And he's
YouTube. You
trying
can
to
leave me
figure out
open if you
what
decide to do
a
something else.
control way you
'cause
might say the same sentence.
can't do that anywhere
is
else
in
really
that
effectively.
language. And
Twitch
so we
doesn't
just
do it
like,
very
All
effectively.
right, there's a root, and it has. Let's say as a sentence is. Let's go back to 2 dogs entered the room. So entered is the root, and entered has 2 dependents. It's got dogs and it has room. Okay, and what he does is like, let's scramble that order. That's 3 things: the root and the head and the 2 dependents, and into some random order, just random. And then just do that for all the dependents down the 2. So now do it for the and whatever was 2 in dogs and for and room. And that's that's not it's a very short sentence. When sentences get longer and you have more dependents, there's more scrambling that's possible. And what he found was that's one.
You can
figure out
scramble your
one
sentence a
scrambling
little
for that
bit,
sentence. He did it like
the
100
longer it
times
is.
for every sentence in every one of these texts, every corpus, and then he just compared
almost
the
have
dependency lengths in those random
these
scramblings
Superior
to
Hatch.
what actually happened, what the English or the French or the German was in the original language, or Chinese, or what all these like 60 languages, okay, and the dependency lengths are always shorter in the real language compared to this kind of a control. And there's another. It's a little more rigid, his control. So the way I described it, you could have crossed dependencies, like by scrambling that way. You could scramble in any way at all. Languages don't do that. They tend not to cross dependencies very much. Like
Level
so the
7 out of
dependency structure,
40.
They tend to keep things non-crossed. And there's there's a technical
peanut.
term they call that projective, but it's just non-crossed is all that is, projective. And so if you just constrain the scrambling so that it only gives you projective, sort of non-crossed, is the same thing holds. Still human languages are much shorter than this kind of a control. So there's like what it means is that we're in every language we're trying to put things close in relative to this kind of a control. Like it doesn't matter about the word order. Some of these are verb final, some of them these are verb medial like English, and some are even verb initial. There are a few languages of the world which have ESO, word order, verb, subject, object languages. I haven't talked about those. It's like 10% of the.
And even in those languages, it's still short dependencies.
Short dependencies is rules.
Okay, so what are some possible explanations for that? For why languages have evolved that way? So that's one of the I suppose disagreements you might have with Chomsky. So you consider the evolution of language in terms of information theory.
Yeah.
And for you, the purpose of language is ease of communication, right? And processing.
The colors are funny that is fostered by the leaf
So
cutter
I mean,
ant.
the story here is just about communication. It is just about production, really. It's about ease of production is the story.
When you say production, can you?
Oh, I just mean ease of language production. It's easier for me to say things when I'm doing whatever I'm talking to you. So somehow I'm formulating some idea in my head and I'm putting these words together, and it's easier for me to do that. Say something where the words are closely connected in a dependency, as opposed to separated, like by putting something in between and over again. It's just hard for me to keep that in my head. That's the whole story. Like the story, it's basically, I say that the dependency grammar sort of gives that to you, like just like long is bad, short is good. It's like easier to keep in mind because you have to keep it in mind probably for production, probably matters in comprehension as well. Like also matters in comprehension.
It's on both sides of the production. And
but I would guess it's probably evolved for production. It's about producing. It's what's easier for me to say that ends up being easier for you also. That's very hard to disentangle, this idea of who's it for.
Let's keep doing the pheromones.
Me, the speaker, or is it for you,
and then I'm going to upgrade my
listener?
queen.
I mean, part of my language is for you. Like the way I talk to you is going to be different from how I talk to different people. Right? So I'm definitely angling what I'm saying to who I'm saying, right? It's not like I'm just talking the same way to every single person. And so I am sensitive to my audience, but how does does that work itself out in the dependency length differences? I don't know. Maybe that's about just the words, that part, which words I select.
My initial intuition is
to engage with your audience the way that they want to be engaged with, no matter who they are.
Yeah.
Even if it's a one-on-one.
But it's both.
It's just kind of like messing with my head a little bit to say that some of the optimization might be, maybe the primary objective of the optimization might be the ease of production.
Yeah, we have different senses, I guess. I'm like very selfish, and you're like, I'm like, I think it's all about me. I'm like, I'm just doing what's easiest for me at all times. I don't want to. I'm like, but I have to, of course, choose the words that I think you're going to know. I'm not going to choose words you don't know. In fact, I'm going to fix that when so there it's about, but maybe for
2 minutes.
For the syntax, for the combinations, it's just about me. I feel like I don't know though. It's very hard.
Wait. But the purpose of communication is to be understood, is to convince others and so on. Yeah. So like the selfish thing is to be understood.
Okay,
so
it's
about
a
the
little
listener.
circular there too then. Okay.
Right.
Build speed.
I mean, like the ease of production
helps me be understood then. I don't think it's circular. So I think the primary objective is to be understood, is about the listener, because otherwise if you're optimizing for the ease of production,
you want to be understood, because if you're understood, then they're going to be able to respond the way that they need to, that works for them. You wouldn't like force them into it, but you want to be understood by your listener. That's why you use language in the first place, so that you can communicate and be understood by your listener, so that whatever you convey is understood by the next person, and whatever they convey is understood by you.
Is all I'm talking about. You're talking about a harder thing. It's like, how am I like trying to change the meaning? Let's keep the meaning constant. Like
got it.
If you keep the meaning constant, how can I phrase whatever it is I need to say? Like I got to pick the right words, and I'm going to pick the order so that it's easy for me. That's what I think is probably
I think I'm still tying meaning and form together in my head. But you're saying if you keep the meaning of what you're saying constant,
don't demean me.
The optimization, it could be the primary objective of that optimization is
you get it
for production. That's
you
interesting.
Get it.
I'm struggling to keep constant the meaning. It's just so. I mean, I'm a human, right? So for me, the form, without having introspected on this, the form and the meaning are tied together, like deeply.
Deform.
Because I'm a human. Like for me, when I'm speaking, because I haven't thought about language, like in a rigorous way, about the form of language.
The form.
For any event, there's an unbounded. I don't want to say infinite, but sort of ways that I might communicate that same event. This 2 dogs entered a room. I can say in many different ways. I can say, "Hey, there's 2 dogs. They entered the room.
2 stupid dogs.
Hey, the room was entered by something. The thing that was entered was 2 dogs." I mean, it's kind of awkward and weird and stuff. But those are all similar messages with different forms, but different ways I might frame. And of course, I use the same words there all the time. I could have referred to the dogs as, a Dalmatian and a poodle or something. I could have been more specific or less specific about what they are, and I could have been more abstract about the number. There's I'm trying to keep the meaning, which is this event, constant, and then how am I going to describe that to get that to you? It kind of depends on what you need to know, right? And what I think you need to know. But I'm let's control for all that stuff and not and it's I'm just choosing I'm doing something simpler than you're doing, which is just forms.
Yes.
Just words.
So to you, specifying the species, the breed of dog, and whether they're cute or not is changing the meaning.
That might be, yeah, that would be changing. Oh, that would be changing the meaning for sure.
Right. So you're just Well, yeah.
That's changing the meaning. But say even if we keep that constant, we can
Queen
still
level
talk
9.
about what's easier or hard for me, right? The listener and the right. I can talk about which phrase structures I use, which combinations,
This is so fascinating, and just like a really powerful window into human language. But I wonder still throughout this how vast the gap between meaning and form.
This whole stream is about upgrading that queen to level 9.
Maybe romanticized notion that they're close together, that they evolve close, like hand in hand, that you can't just simply optimize for one without the other being in the room with us. Like it's kind of like an iceberg. Form is the tip of the iceberg, and the rest, the meaning is the iceberg. But you can't separate.
But I think that's why these large language models are so successful, is because they're good at form, and form
Here
isn't
we
that
go.
hard in some sense. And meaning is tough still, and that's why they don't understand what they're doing. We're going to talk about that later maybe, but we can distinguish in forget about large language models, like humans, maybe you'll talk about that later too, is like the difference between language, which is a communication system, and thinking, which is meaning. So language is a communication system for the meaning. It's not the meaning. And so that's why, and there's a lot of interesting evidence we can talk about relevant to that.
Well, that's a really interesting question. What is the difference between language, written, communicated, versus thought? What to use the difference between them?
Well,
interesting.
You or anyone has to think of a task which they think is a good thinking task, and there's lots and lots of tasks which would be good thinking tasks, and whatever those tasks are, let's say it's playing chess, or that's a good thinking task, or playing some game, or doing some complex puzzles, maybe remembering some digits, that's thinking, remembering a lot of different tasks we might think. Maybe just listening to music is thinking, or there's a lot of different tasks we might think of as thinking.
The thing is, a thought that you could express, it may not even be words. It may be a feeling.
On this question about what's
something.
The connection
Like it may not even be something that's tangible in the form of words.
She uses, I was referring earlier to
Evelina
MRI.
Fedorenko.
That's her primary method.
Evelina Fedorenko.
So she has been really fascinated by this question about what language is, okay? And so, as I mentioned earlier, you can localize my language area, your language area in a few minutes, okay? In like 15 minutes, I can listen to language, listen to non-language or backward speech or something, and we'll find areas, left lateralized network in my head, which is very sensitive to language as opposed to whatever that control was, okay?
Can you specify what you mean by language, like communicated language?
What is language? Just sentences. I'm listening to English of any kind, story, or I can read sentences, anything at all that I understand. If I understand it, then it'll activate my language network. So right now, my language network is going like crazy when I'm talking and when I'm listening to you, because we're communicating.
And that's pretty stable.
Yeah, it's incredibly stable. So I happen to be married to this woman at Fedorenko, and so I've been scanned by her over and over since 2007 or 6 or something. And so my language network is exactly the same, a month ago as it was back in 2007.
Oh, wow.
It's amazingly stable. It's astounding. And with it, it's a really fundamentally cool thing. And so my language network is like my face. Okay, it's not changing much over time inside my head.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry, it's a small tangent. At which point as you grow up from baby to adult, does it stabilize?
We don't know. That's a very hard question. They're working on that right now because of the problem scanning little kids. Like trying to do the localization on little children in this scanner. Right? You're lying in the fMRI scan. That's the best way to figure out where something's going on inside our brains. And the scanner is loud, and you're in this tiny little area. You're claustrophobic, and it doesn't bother me at all. I can go to sleep in there. But some people are bothered by it, and little kids don't really like it, and they don't like to lie still. And you have to be really still because if you move around, that messes up the coordinates of where
it does.
And so, try to get. Your question is how and when are language developing? How does this left lateralized system come to play? Where does it? And it's really hard to get a 2-year-old to do this task. But you can they're starting to get 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds to do this task for short periods. And it looks like it's there pretty early.
So clearly when you lead up to like a baby's first words, before that, there's a lot of fascinating turmoil going on about like figuring out like, what are these people saying?
Yeah.
And you're trying to like make sense. How does that connect to the world and all that kind of stuff? Yeah, that might be just fascinating development that's happening there. That's hard to introspect. But anyways,
we're back to the scanner.
Yes.
And I can find my network.
Anyways, we're back to the scanner. That was the quickest segue.
Anyways,
we're back to the scanner.
20 other people do this task.
Yep.
And we can do some other tasks. Anything else you think is thinking of some other thing.
Lex, I appreciate you having me on here. But anyways, we're back to the scanner.
I can do a music perception task. I can do programming task if I program. Okay, I can do where I can like understand computer programs, and none of those tasks tap the language network at all. Like at all. There's no overlap. They're highly activated in other parts of the brain. There's a bilateral network, which I think she tends to call the multiple demands network, which does anything kind of hard. And so anything that's kind of difficult in some ways will activate that multiple demands network. I mean, music will be in some music area, there's music specific kinds of areas. And so, but none of them are activating the language area at all, unless there's words. Like, so if you have music and there's a song and you can hear the words, then you get the language area.
Are we talking about speaking and listening, or are we also talking about reading?
This is all comprehension of any kind, and so
that is fascinating.
So what this network doesn't make any difference if it's written or spoken. So the thing that she calls, Fedorenko calls the language network is this high level language. So it's not about the spoken.
It's cool. He's responding to his wife,
and it's not about the written language. It's about
That's
either
her last
one
name.
of them.
That's
and
cool.
So when you do speech, you're sort of you listen to speech and you subtract away some language.
It's just
you don't
odd to hear.
And so or you
if you know their husband and wife.
Speech, which sounds like speech but isn't, and then so you take away the sound part altogether, and then if you do written, you get exactly the same network. So for just reading the language versus reading sort of nonsense words or something like that, you'll find
nonsense
exactly
words.
the same network. And so this is about
What's
high
that?
level
comprehension
of language, in this case. And the same thing happens. Production is a little harder to run the scanner, but the same thing happens in production. You get the same network.
Yeah.
So production's a little harder, right? You have to figure out how do you run a task, in the network such that you're doing some kind of production. And I can't remember they've done a bunch of different kinds of tasks there where you get people to produce things. Figure out how to produce. And the same network goes on there, exactly the same place. And
so if you so if you read random words,
if you read things like
gibberish.
Lewis Carroll's "'Twas Brillig," Jabberwocky, right? They call that Jabberwocky speech. Or
the network doesn't get activated.
Not as much. There are words in there.
Yeah, because
there's function words and stuff. So it's lower activation.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So there's basically the more language like it is, the
Anyways,
higher
we're
it
back to
goes
brain
in the language
scans.
network. And that network
Oh
is
man,
there
that was so funny.
from when you speak, from as soon as you learn language, and it's there.
Even he's
multiple
laughing.
languages. The same network is going for your multiple languages. So you speak English, you speak Russian. Both of them are hitting that same network. If you're fluent in those languages.
So programming,
not at all. Isn't that amazing? Even if you're a really good programmer, that is not a human language. It's just not conveying the same information. And so it is not in the language network. And so
that as mind-blowing as I think. That's
pretty
weird.
Cool.
That's weird.
It is amazing.
That's
and
really
so
weird.
that's like one set of data. This is hers, like shows that what you might think is thinking is not language. Language is just
I wanted a yellow and I got a yellow.
Just this conventionalized system that we've worked out in human languages. Oh, another fascinating little tidbit is that even if they're these constructed languages like Klingon or I don't know the languages from Game of Thrones. I'm sorry, I don't remember those languages. Maybe
a lot of people offended right now.
There's people that speak
I'm
those
offended.
languages.
I'm watching Game of Thrones right now. Y'all better know your Dothraki and your Valerian and your High Valerian.
The languages for the shows, they did an amazing job of constructing something like a human language, and that lights up the language area.
That is a human language.
That's like because they can speak, pretty much arbitrary thoughts in a human language. It's a constructed human language, and it's related to human languages because the people that were constructing them were making them like human languages in various ways. But it also activates the same network, which is pretty cool. Anyway,
sorry to go into a place where you may be a little bit philosophical, but is it possible that this area of the brain is doing some kind of translation into a deeper set of almost like concepts?
So it has to be doing. So it's doing in communication, right? It is translating from thought, whatever that is more abstract.
Whatever it is.
That's what it's doing.
Agreed.
Like it is, that is kind of what it is doing.
And
it's like kind of a meaning network, I guess.
Yeah, like a translation network.
Yeah.
But I wonder what is at the core, at the bottom of it. Like, what are thoughts? Are thoughts, to me, like,
I don't know.
Thoughts and words, are they neighbors or is it one turtle sitting on top of the other? Meaning, like, is there a deep set of concepts that we
well there's connections right between what these things mean, and then there's probably other parts of the brain that what these things mean. And so when I'm talking about whatever it is I want to talk about, if it's it'll be represented somewhere else. That knowledge of whatever that is will be represented somewhere else.
Well, I wonder if there's like some stable, nicely compressed encoding of meanings.
I don't know.
That's separate
I know
from
I'm
language.
defeated.
That link, I guess the implication here is that we don't think in language.
That's correct. Isn't that cool?
We don't think in language.
So people,
that's true.
This is like hard to do experiments on, but there is this idea.
That's what I was meaning a little while ago.
And a lot of people
you don't
have an
think.
inner voice. And so if you do,
you may think of words, but you don't think in words.
When you're just thinking or whatever. About 70.
You think in concepts.
Will say yes. Most people have an inner voice. I don't. And so I always find this strange when people talk about an inner voice. I always thought this was a metaphor, and they hear.
Why do I win sometimes and lose sometimes? That's what I want to know. That's a concept I want to know about.
I don't have.
Why do I win sometimes and I have the same setup and I lose sometimes?
Kind of annoying to me, but to have this voice going on while you're thinking. But I guess most people have that. And I don't have that, and we don't really know what that connects to.
I wonder if the inner voice activates that same network.
I don't know. I don't know. But I mean, this could be speechy, right? So that's like if you hear. Do you have an inner voice?
I don't think so.
Oh.
I don't need a blue.
A lot of people have this sense that they hear other people. They hear themselves, and then say they read someone's email. I've heard people tell me that they hear that other person's voice when they read other people's in emails, and I'm like, wow, that sounds so disruptive.
I do think I like vocalize when I'm reading, but I don't think I hear a voice.
Well,
okay, I got my reds.
Yeah, I don't think I have.
People have an inner voice. People have this strong percept of hearing sound in their heads when they're just thinking.
I refuse to believe that's the majority of people.
Majority, absolutely.
What?
It's like 2/3 or 3/4. It's
what?
I hear people's voices whenever I think of what they say. I feel like I hear their like I hear I read the words in their voice.
It could be.
When I'm reading.
Yeah.
Inside.
If I know their voice.
I'm kind of like saying the words, which is probably the wrong way to read, but I don't hear a voice. There's no percept of a voice. I refuse to believe the majority of people have it. Anyway.
But Lex, I'm here to tell you.
The human brain is fascinating.
I'm one of them.
It still blew my mind that that language does appear, comprehension does appear to be separate from thinking.
So that's one set of data from Fedorenko's group is that no matter
from
what
his wife's group,
if it doesn't have words and combinations of words in it, then it won't light up the language network. And it'll be active somewhere else, but not there.
No more
so
greens.
That's one. And then this other piece of evidence relevant to that question is it turns out there are this group of people who've had a massive stroke on the left side and wiped out their language network. And as long as they didn't wipe out everything on the right as well, in that case they wouldn't be, cognitively functionable. But if they just wiped out language, which is pretty tough to do because it's,
I don't need
it's
reds
very
either.
expensive on the left. But if they have, then there's patients like this so-called global aphasics who
Did you see what I just did? I just took my 28 red and threw them away. I meant to grab the 23.
They don't understand you. They can't speak. Can't write.
I here have made up head voice for them. Yeah. That's, I mean, I feel like that's normal. Like when you're reading it, like you have some kind of impression of their voice. If you know their voice, if you've heard it. If you haven't heard their voice, then probably not.
Symbols. So people sort of confuse some kind of symbolic
Or you're probably
processing
making
language,
up something.
Symbolic processing is not the same. So there are symbols and they have meaning, but it's not language. It's not a
Looks like I need reds again.
So math isn't there, and so they can do math. They do just as well as their age match controls and all these tasks. This is Rosemary Varley over in University College London, who has a bunch of patients who she's shown this, that they're just so that sort
I don't
of
need yellows.
Suggests
I don't need reds.
Language
no, I don't need yellows and I don't need greens.
It doesn't mean
and I don't need blues.
Language. You could think in language, because language allows a lot of expression, but it's just you don't need it.
I need reds.
It suggests that language is separate, a separate
all
system.
Reds.
It's kind of blowing my mind right now.
It's cool, isn't it?
I'm trying to load that in because it has implications for.
I just threw away red. You want to know why? Because
models.
I'm just.
It sure does. And
I'm listening to my other head voice.
Well, let's take a stroll there. You wrote that the best current theories of human language are arguably large language models. So this has to do with form.
It's a kind of a big theory. And but the reason it's arguably the best is that it does the best at predicting what's English, for instance. It's like incredibly good. It's better than any other theory. It's so but we don't there's not enough detail.
Well, it's opaque. Like there's not you don't know what's going on.
You don't know what's going on. It's another black box. But I think it's it is a theory.
What's your definition of a theory? Because it's a gigantic. It's a gigantic black box with a very large number of parameters controlling it. To me, theory usually requires a simplicity, right?
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm just being loose there. I think it's not a
being
great
loose
theory. It's a good theory in one sense, in that it covers all the data. Like anything you want to say in English, it does, and so that's
I need more reds.
That's how it's arguably.
Sometimes I win, sometimes I lose.
No other theory is as good as a large language model in predicting exactly.
If you ever played Ace Attorney, that's a fun one to come up with fun voices for each character.
Probably not, because I want a smaller theory.
But
it's too big.
Impersonation is always a really fun one. A really fun
by which it can generate a simple
activity
explanation of a particular language, like a set of rules.
Don't you agree?
Something like it could generate a dependency grammar for a language, right?
Yes.
You could probably.
I need reds. Look at all those reds.
Just ask it about itself.
Well, that's. I mean, that presumes. And there's some evidence for this that some large language models are implementing something like dependency grammar inside them. And so there's work from a guy called Chris Manning and colleagues over at Stanford in natural language, and they looked
Let's
at.
see if we can get all
I don't
red.
know how many large language model types, but certainly BERT and some others, where you do some kind of fancy math to figure out exactly what the what kind of abstractions of representations are going on, and they were saying it does look like dependency structure is what they're constructing. It doesn't so it's actually a very, very good map. So kind of they are constructing something like that.
I just threw it away.
Does it mean that that they're using that for meaning? I mean, probably, but we don't know.
You write that the kinds of theories of language that LLMs are closest to
are
called construction-based theories. Can you explain what construction-based theories are?
It's just a general theory of language, such that there's a form and a meaning pair for lots of pieces.
I just want a red one.
So it's primarily usage-based. Is a construction grammar. It's trying to deal with the things that people actually say and actually write. And so that's a
give me a red
idea. And what's a construction? Well, a construction is either a simple word, so like a morpheme plus its meaning, or a combination of words. It's basically combinations of words, like the rules. So,
there it is.
But it's specified as to what the form of the grammar is underlyingly. And so I would argue that the dependency grammar is maybe the right form to use for the types of construction grammar. Construction grammar typically isn't kind of formalized quite. And so maybe a formalization of that, it might be in dependency grammar.
Nursery level 9.
I think so, but
Queen level 9.
It's up to people, other researchers in that area, if they agree or not. So,
do you think that large language models understand language? Are they mimicking language? I guess the deeper question there is:
does the AI understand language, or is it mimicking it?
Or do they understand?
Do we understand language, or are we mimicking
the
it?
meaning that then generates the form.
I mean, I would argue they're doing the form. They're doing the form, doing it really, really well. Are they doing the meaning? No, probably not. I mean, there's lots of these examples from various groups showing that they can be tricked in all kinds of ways. They really don't understand the meaning of what's going on. And so there's a lot of examples that he and other groups have given, which show they don't really understand what's going on. So you know the Monty Hall problem.
That scared me. The Monty Hall problem.
Right?
Okay,
Where,
okay.
You know,
Hold on. Okay, so this one's been coming up a lot for me lately, right? And I'm gonna tell you why. Because as of yesterday, or day before yesterday, I made a short clip on YouTube that was based on game shows. I'm playing Fortnite and my character, I'll just show you the clip. You want to see the clip? I'll tell you what, I'll just show you the clip. YouTube, it's a very short clip, but as I was doing the clip, as I was making the clip, I kept getting the Monty Hall problem over and over and over and over and over and over and over. So let's see, let me get this squared out for you. So this is door number 1, okay? This is just a real short clip, real funny clip that I wanted to make, and it's based off of the idea of door number 1, door number 2, door number 3. So the Monty Hall problem is essentially a problem and is described in this movie 21. If you've ever seen 21, it's a movie about like the gamblers who are trying to like go play poker and win the money. Anyway, door number 1, this is basically just me going into a door, hitting someone, and deciding whether I want to go back or not. So this is door number 1.
Do you want to stay with door number 1 or go with door number 2?
I think I'll stick with door number 1. Anyway, so as I was like doing my thing, the Monty Hall problem came up, and for this, I'm gonna go ahead and minimize this real quick, just so we all get to watch this. Okay, cool.
You have 3 doors. It's Let's Make a Deal is this old game show, and there's 3 doors.
Suppose you're on a game show and you're given a choice of 3 doors. Behind one door is a car. Behind the others, goats. You pick a door, say number 1, and the host, who knows what's behind the doors, opens another door and says number 3, which has a goat. He then says to you, do you want to pick door number 2? Is it to your advantage to switch your choice? Savant's response was that the contestant should switch to the other door. By the standard assumptions, the switching strategy has a 2/3 probability of winning the car, while the strategy of keeping the initial choice has only a 1/3 probability. Now, here's what I would say about that, okay? You always have a 1/3 chance of winning the car if you only get one choice and they reveal the doors one at a time. Because if there are 3 choices, you only get to choose one of the 3. Now, you may have chosen a door that was the winner at one point, but whether you get it on the second choice or not, who knows? You still picked the first one, right? Now they're saying you get like, a 2/3 probability of winning the car, because on the first one you had a 33% chance of winning, right? And then the second time you get to choose 2 doors, which is a 50% chance of winning. And then you multiply those together, whatever it is, right? The Monty Hall problem for me, like, just seeing that, I don't know that you should switch to the other door, because it doesn't really make a difference on whether you're right or not, unless the thing behind the door is constantly switching. And even then, like, now you're talking quantum strategy. Like, I don't know what you think, but I still think that you still have a 1/3 choice. My opinion may change. Let's see what he has to say about it.
And there's a prize behind one, and there's some junk prizes behind the other 2, and you're trying to select one. And if he knows, Monty, he knows where the target item is, the good thing. He knows everything is back there. And you're supposed to, he gives you a choice. You choose one of the 3. And then he opens one of the doors, and it's some junk prize. And then the question is, should you trade to get the other one? And the answer is yes, you should trade, because he knew which ones you could turn around.
Yes.
And so now the odds
almost
are
like Schrodinger's cat.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then if you just change that a little bit to the large language model, the large language model, just seen that explanation so many times that it just, if you change the story just a little bit, but it make it sound like it's the Monty Hall problem, but it's not. You just say, there's 3 doors, and one behind them is a good prize, and there's 2 bad doors. I happen to know it's behind door number 1. The good prize, the car, is behind door number 1. So I'm going to choose door number 1. Monty Hall opens door number 3 and shows me nothing there. Should I trade for door number 2? Even though I know the good prize is in door number 1. And then the large language model say, yes, you should trade, because it just goes through the forms that it's seen before so many times on these cases, where yes, you should trade, because your odds have shifted from 1 and 3 now to 2 out of 3 to being that thing. It doesn't have any way to remember that actually you have 100% probability behind that door number 1. You know that's not part of the scheme that it's seen hundreds and hundreds of times before. And so you can't even if you try to explain to it that it's wrong, that they can't do that. It'll just keep giving you back the problem.
But it's also possible that a large language model will be aware of the fact that there's sometimes over-representation of a particular kind of formulation, and it's easy to get tricked by that. And so you could see, if they get larger and larger, models be a little bit more skeptical. So you see over-representation. So it just feels like training on form can go really far in terms of being able to generate
it can go far.
Things that look like the thing understands.
Human language can go very far.
Deeply the underlying world model of the kind of mathematical world, physical world, psychological world that would generate these kinds of sentences. It just feels like you're creeping close to the meaning part. Easily fooled, all this kind of stuff, but that's humans too. So it just seems really impressive how often it seems like it understands concepts.
I mean, you don't have to convince me of that. I am very, very impressed. But you're giving a possible world where maybe someone's going to train some other version such that it'll be somehow abstracting away from types of forms.
Now, I'll also say that in the Monty Hall problem, you actually have somewhere around a 40% chance of getting the correct guess on the 1 of 3 doors. If they say this door is the incorrect one, your second one is a little closer to, you have a 50% chance in the second option. You have a 30% chance, a 33% chance in the first option. But you have about a 41% chance total if that's the way that they're going to reveal the doors. You have a 40-something% chance if they give you 2 different guesses. Like if they let you change your choice, like if you said, hey, okay, look, you got 3 doors. You're going to pick one, and I'm going to tell you what one of the incorrect ones were, or what one of the ones you didn't guess is. And then I'm going to allow you to change your guess if you want to. then you have a 40% chance. Now, whether you choose the right thing or not, who knows, right? Because essentially you're given two choices, one at 33, one at 50. You add them both together and you come up with the mean of 41.5, right? So it's funny how the chances actually work. Anyway, it is what it is. It am what it am. And, I'm no MIT guru or anything like that, so.
Humans don't make that error. If you explain that to them, they're not going to make that error. They don't make that error. And so that's something, it's doing something different from humans.
Make sure to download Ant Game. Help me
what's
out.
What's the mechanism by which humans figure out that it's an error?
I'm just saying.
Let's go back to MIT. Let's go back to large language models. I don't have all f***ing day.
The cars behind this case, this door. Do you want to trade? People say no,
but
this thing will say yes because it's so that trick. It's so wound up on the form that that's an error that a human doesn't make, which is kind of interesting.
Less likely to make, I should say.
Yeah, less likely.
Because like humans are very.
Oh yeah.
Where's my snail? How do I get my snail?
Asking,
that's what I want to know.
You're asking a system to understand 100%. Like you're asking some mathematical concepts, and so like.
Look, the places where large language models are, the form is amazing. So let's go back to nested structures, center embedded structures. Okay, if you ask a human to complete those, they can't do it. Neither can a large language model.
You got 2 hours left, and it's only been an hour.
If I ask a large language model,
that's fascinating, by the way.
That's
the central embedding.
Yeah,
the central embedding is struggles with
just
completing.
like human, exactly like humans,
Wow.
exactly the same way as humans. They get, and that's not trained. So they do exactly. So that is the similarity. So, but then that's not meaning. Right, this is form, but when we get into meaning, this is where they get kind of messed up. When you start just saying, "Oh, what's behind this door? Oh, it's this is the thing I want." Humans don't mess that up as much. Here the form it's just like the form. The match is amazing, similar, without being trained to do that. I mean, it's trained in the sense that it's getting.
I need more specialized ants,
just like human data, but it's not being trained on, bad sentences and being told what's bad. It just can't do those. It'll actually say things like those are too hard for me to complete or something, which is kind of interesting. Actually, kind of, how does it know that? I don't know.
But it really often doesn't just complete very often says stuff that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And sometimes says stuff that's not true. And almost always the form is great.
Yeah.
But it's still very surprising that with really great form, it's able to generate a lot of things that are true based on what it's trained on and so on.
Yes.
So it's not just form that is generating; it's mimicking true statements.
That's right.
From the internet. I guess the underlying idea there is that on the internet, truth is overrepresented versus falsehoods.
I think that's probably right. Yeah.
So, but the fundamental thing is trained on, you're saying, is just form.
I need a level 9 queen.
Yeah, I think so.
Again.
Well, that's a sad. If that's to me, that's still a little bit of an open question. I probably lean agreeing with you, especially now you just blown my mind that there's a separate module in the brain for language versus thinking. Maybe there's a fundamental part missing.
Of course, there is.
The large language model approach.
Language is a construct of thinking.
The reasoning capability.
Yeah, that's what.
And thinking is a construct of
the same group, Fedorenko's group, has a recent paper arguing exactly that. There's a guy called Kyle Mahwell who's here in Austin, Texas, actually. He's an old student of mine, but he's a faculty in linguistics at Texas, and he was the first author on that.
That's fascinating. Still, to me, an open question.
Yeah.
Interesting.
What do you are the interesting limits of LLMs?
I don't see any limits to their form. Their form is
impressive.
Perfect. Yeah. It's pretty much. I mean, it's close to being.
Well, you said ability to complete central embeddings.
Yeah, it's just the same as humans. It seems the same.
But that's not perfect, right? It should.
That's good. No, but I want it to be like humans. I want a model of humans.
But wait. Oh, so perfect is as close to humans as possible.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah.
But you should be able to, if you're not human, you're superhuman. You should be able to complete central.
I will say this one in comparison to the zombie game, this one doesn't have as much stuff to do.
The mechanism is if it's modeling some. I think it's kind of really interesting that it
Then
can't.
it's really interesting.
That it's more really like I think it's potentially underlyingly modeling something like what the way the form is processed.
The form of human language.
Yeah, the way
and
that
how humans process the language.
Yes, I think that's plausible.
And how they generate language, process language and generate language. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they're perfect. If we can just linger on the center embedding thing, that's hard for LLMs to produce, and that seems really impressive because that's hard for humans to produce. And how does that connect?
They are social creatures.
To the thing we've been talking about before, which is the dependency grammar framework in which you view language, and the finding that short dependencies seem to be a universal part of language. So why is it hard to complete center embeddings?
So what I like about dependency grammar
upgraded that queen to level 9. What you know about that?
Very transparent. Basically, there's some there turns out there is a cost associated with producing and comprehending connections between words which are just not beside each other. The further apart they are, the worse it is. And according to, well, we can measure that, and there is a cost associated with that.
Can you just linger on what do you mean by cognitive cost?
Sure.
And how do you measure it?
Oh, well, you can measure it in a lot of ways. The simplest is just asking people to say whether, how good a sentence sounds. We just ask. That's one way to measure, and you try to triangulate then across sentences and across structures to try to figure out what the source of that is. You can look at reading times in controlled materials, and so in certain kinds of materials and then we can measure the dependency distances there. There's a recent study which looked at, we're talking about the brain here. We could look at the language network, okay? We could look at the language network, and we could look at the activation in the language network and how big the activation is depending on the length of the dependencies. And it turns out in just random sentences that you're listening to, if you're listening to, so it turns out there are people listening to stories here, and the longer the dependency is, the stronger the activation in the language network. And so there's some measure. There's a bunch of different measures we could do. That's a kind of a neat measure, actually, of actual activation in the brain.
So that you can somehow, in different ways, convert it to a number. I wonder if there's a beautiful equation connecting cognitive cost and length of dependency.
Mm-hmm.
E equals MC squared kind of thing.
Yeah, it's complicated, but probably it's doable. I would guess it's doable. I tried to do that a while ago, and I was reasonably successful, but for some reason I stopped working on that. I agree with you that it would be nice to figure out. So there's some way to figure out the cost. I mean, it's complicated. Another issue you raised before was how do you measure distance? Is it words? And it probably isn't. Is the part of the problem is that some words matter more than others, and probably meaning like nouns might matter depending, and then it maybe depends on which kind of noun. Is it a noun we've already introduced or a noun that's already been mentioned? Is it a pronoun versus a name? Like all these things probably matter. So probably the simplest thing to do is just let's forget about all that and just think about words or morphemes.
For sure, but there might be a kind there might be some insight in the kind of function that fits the data, meaning a quadratic, what.
I think it's an exponential. So we think it's probably an exponential such that the longer the distance, the less it matters. And so then it's the sum of those is that was our best guess a while ago. So you've got a bunch of dependencies. If you've got a bunch of them that are being connected at some point, that's at the ends of those, the cost is some exponential function of those is my guess. But because the reason it's probably an exponential is it's not just the distance between two words, because I can make a very, very long subject-verb dependency by adding lots and lots of noun phrases and prepositional phrases, and it doesn't matter too much. It's when you do nested, when I have multiple of these, then things go really bad. It goes south.
Probably somehow connected to working memory or something like this.
That's probably a function of the memory here is the access, is trying to find those earlier things. It's kind of hard to figure out what was referred to earlier. Those are those connections. That's the sort of notion of murky, as opposed to a storagey thing, but trying to connect, retrieve those earlier words depending on what was in between. And then we're talking about interference of similar things in between. That's the right theory probably has that kind of notion in it, is an interference of similar And so I'm dealing with an abstraction over the right theory, which is just, let's count words. It's not right, but it's close. And then maybe you're right, though. There's some sort of an exponential or something to figure out the total, so we can figure out a function for any given sentence in any given language. But it's funny. People haven't done that too much, which I do think is. I'm interested that you find that interesting. I really find that interesting, and a lot of people haven't found it interesting, and I don't know why. I haven't got people to want to work on that. I really like that too.
No,
I don't know about that. Your argument's not very convincing.
It's beautiful that there's a cognitive cost that correlates with the length of dependency.
I think you're bandwagoning right now.
It feels like it's a deep. Language is so fundamental to the human experience.
That's just a gut feeling.
This is a nice, clean theory of language, where
but that's okay.
Wow, okay.
I'm just playing
we like our words close together.
Yeah,
the dependent words close together.
Yeah, that's why I like it too. It's so simple.
Yeah, the simplicity of the theory.
Don't pander to me.
It explains some very complicated phenomena. If I
whatever you want
these
to
very
do.
complicated
Cool
sentences, it's kind of hard to know why they're so hard. And you can
That's
nail it down. I can do give you a math formula for why each one of them is bad and where. And that's kind of cool. I think that's very neat.
Have you gone through the process? Is there like a
ant game?
You take a piece of text and then simplify. Sort of like there's an average length of dependency, and then you reduce it and see comprehension on the entire, not just a single sentence, but you go from James Joyce to Hemingway or something.
No. A simple answer is no. That does. There's probably things you can do in that kind of direction.
That's fun.
We might, we're going to talk about legalese at some point,
yes.
And so maybe we'll talk about that kind of thinking with applied to legalese. But
let's talk about legalese, because you mentioned that as an exception.
Legalese.
Taking tangent upon tangent. That's an interesting one. You give it as an exception.
It's an exception.
That you say that most natural languages, as we've been talking about, have local dependencies, with one exception, legalese.
That's right.
What's legalese?
So legalese?
Tell me.
First of all.
Oh, well, legalese is what you think it is. It's just any legal language.
I actually know very little about the kind of language lawyers use.
Legalese.
So I'm just talking about language in laws and language in
how it's
contracts.
understood based on what a normal person would understand in that culture.
Run into every other day or every day, and you skip over because it reads poorly, or partly it's just long, right? There's a lot of text there that we don't really want to know about, and so. But the thing I'm interested in, so I've been working with this guy called Eric Martinez, who is he was a lawyer who was taking my class. I was teaching a psycholinguistics lab class I have been teaching it for a long time at MIT, and he was a law student at Harvard. And he took the class because he had done some linguistics as an undergrad, and he was interested in the problem of why legalese sounds hard to understand. Why, and so why is it hard to understand, and why do they write that way if it is so hard to understand? It seems apparent that it's hard to understand. The question is, why is it? And so we didn't know. And we did an evaluation of a bunch of contracts. Actually, we just took a bunch of sort of random contracts, because I don't know, there's contracts and laws might not be exactly the same, but contracts are kind of the things that most people have to deal with most of the time. And so that's kind of the most common thing that humans have, that adults in our industrialized society have to deal with a lot. And so that's what we pulled. And we didn't know what was hard about them, but it turns out
make sure they sign those contracts.
The way they're written is very center embedded. It has nested structures in them. So it has low frequency words as well. That's not surprising. Lots of texts have it does have slightly lower frequency words than other kinds of control text, even sort of academic text.
Do I need reds?
These is even worse. It is the worst that we were able to find.
You just revealed the game that lawyers are playing.
They're
optimizing a different. Well,
it's interesting. That's now you're getting at why, and I don't think so. Now you're saying they're doing it intentionally. I don't think they're doing it intentionally. But let's
It's an emergent phenomena. Okay.
It's an emergent phenomena of everyone trying to establish cohesion without wasting too much time figuring out defined details.
Because it turns out that we're not the first to observe.
Everybody want to be understood, but they don't want to waste their time.
Back to Nixon had a Plain Language Act in 1970, and Obama had one, and boy, a lot of these, a lot of presidents have said, we've got to simplify legal language, must simplify it. But if you don't know how it's complicated, it's not easy to simplify it. You need to know what it is you're supposed to do before you can fix it, right? And so you need a psycholinguist to analyze the text and see what's wrong with it before you can like fix it. You don't know how to fix it. How am I supposed to fix something I don't know what's wrong with it? And so what we did was that's what we did. We figured out, we just took a bunch of contracts, had people, and we encoded them for a bunch of features. And so another feature that one of them was center embedding. And so that is like basically how often a clause would intervene between a subject and a verb, for example. That's
30. Okay, we're good with reds.
Clause.
We don't need reds.
And turns out they're massively center embedded. Like, so I think in random contracts and in random laws, I think you get about 70% or 80, something like 70% of sentences have a center embedded clause in them, which is insanely high. If you go to any other
center
text,
embedded clause,
it's down to 20% or something.
Something in the middle that
so
changes
much higher
things
than any control you can think of, including people think, technical academic text. No, people don't write center embedded sentences in technical academic text. I mean, they do a little bit, but it's on the 20%, 30% realm as opposed to 70. And so there's that, and there's low frequency words. And then people, maybe it's passive. People don't like the passive. Passive, for some reason, the passive voice in English has a bad rap, and I'm not really sure where that comes from.
I don't need blues
and there
anymore.
There's a lot of passive in there's much more passive voice in legalese than there is in other
the passive
texts.
voice accounts for some of the low frequency words.
No. Those are separate. Those are separate.
Oh, so passive voice sucks.
These are
low frequency words sucks.
Well, sucks is different. So these are
That's
different.
a judgment on passive.
Drop the judgment. It's just like these are frequent. These are things which happen in legalese text. Then we can ask. Yeah. The dependent measure is like how well you understand
what I meant to do.
Those things with those features. Yes. Okay, and so then it turns out the passive makes no difference. So it has a zero effect on your comprehension ability, on your recall ability. No, nothing at all. That has no effect. The words matter a little bit. They do. Low frequency words are going to hurt you in recall and understanding. But what really hurts is the center embedding. That kills you. That slows people down. That makes them very, very poor at understanding. That makes them they can't recall what was said nearly as well. And we did this not only on lay people. We did it on a lot of lay people. We ran it on 100 lawyers. We recruited lawyers from a wide range of sort of different levels of law firms and stuff. And
just give me all blues and reds.
They have the same pattern. So they also, when they did this, I did not know what would happen. I thought maybe they could process. They're used to legalese. They could process just as well as if it was normal. No. They're much better than lay people. So they're they can much
Don't
better
need blues,
recall,
reds, or greens.
But they have the same
I need yellows
as lay people, exactly the same. So they also much prefer the non-center. So we constructed non-center embedded versions of each of these. We constructed versions which have higher frequency words in those places, and we unpassivized. We turned them into active versions. The passive active made no difference. The words made a little difference, and the uncenter embedding makes big differences in all the populations.
Uncenter embedding. How hard is that process, by the way?
Not very hard.
Sorry, don't question, but how hard is it to detect center embedding?
Easy to detect. That's
you just looking at long dependencies, or is there real?
You can. So there's automatic parsers for English, which are pretty good.
And they can detect center embedding.
Oh yeah. Very,
or I guess nesting.
Perfectly. Pretty much.
So you're not just looking for long dependencies. You're just literally looking for center embed.
Yeah, we are in these cases. But long dependencies they're highly correlated. These kinds of this.
So like a center embedding is a big bomb you throw inside of a sentence that just blows up that makes super.
Yeah. Can I read a sentence for you from these things?
Please do, because it's hard for me to like. It would be hard for me to even say what that is right now. Although I kind of get what you're saying.
I understand that. I mean, legalese is hard.
This is it goes. In the event that any payment or benefit by the company, all such payments and benefits, including the payments and benefits under Section 3A hereof, being hereinafter referred to as a total payment, would be subject to the excise tax, then the cash severance payments shall be reduced. So that's something we pulled from a regular text, from a contract.
Wow.
And the center embedded bit there is just, for some reason, there's a definition. They throw the definition of what payments and benefits are in between the subject and the verb. How about don't do that?
Yeah.
How about put the definition somewhere else as opposed to in the middle of the sentence? And so
Agreed.
that's very, very common, by the way. That's what happens. You just throw your definitions, you use a couple of words, and then you define it, and then you continue the sentence. Just don't write like that. And you ask, so then we asked lawyers. We thought, maybe lawyers like this. Lawyers don't like this. They don't like this. They don't want to write like this. We asked them to rate materials which are with the same meaning, with uncenter embedded and center
Level
embedded,
40.
and they much preferred the uncenter
So we
embedded
go to level
versions.
40 on all of
On
them.
the comprehension, on the reading side.
Yeah, well, and we asked them, would you hire someone who writes like this or this? We asked them all kinds of questions, and they always preferred the less complicated version, all of them. So I don't even think they want it this way.
Yeah, but how did it happen?
How did it happen? That's a very good question.
How did it happen, Lex?
And the answer is, I still don't know. But
I have some theories.
Well, our best theory at the moment is that there's...
Hold up. I'm kidding.
Kind of a performative
Remember,
meaning.
we gotta get back to fucking brain scanning,
which tells you it's legalese. We think that that's the kind of a style which tells you it's legalese.
I got my ants.
It's a reasonable guess, and maybe it's just so. For instance, if you're like, it's like a magic spell. So we kind of call this the magic spell hypothesis.
I'm
so
listening.
When you
magic spells.
When you tell someone to put a magic spell on someone, what do you do? People know what a magic spell is, and they do a lot of rhyming.
Magic spell is your words.
That's kind of what people will tend to do. They'll do rhyming, and they'll do sort of some
stuff
kind of poetry
that influence
kind of
another thing somehow in a way that you can't
maybe
understand.
There's a syntactic sort of
in a way that somebody can't understand anyway.
Of a magic spell, which is center embedding, and so that's like, it's trying to like tell you this is something which is true, which is what the goal of law is, right? Is telling you something that we want you to believe as certainly true, right? That's what legal contracts are trying to enforce on you, right? And so maybe that's like a form which has, this is like an very abstract form, center embedding, which has a meaning associated with it.
All right, we're on chapter 9, guys.
Don't you think there's an incentive
of the ant game, not Lex Fridman,
to generate things that are hard to understand?
That was one of our working hypotheses. We just couldn't find any evidence of that.
No, lawyers also don't understand it. But you're creating space. Why you I mean, you ask in a communist Soviet Union, the individual members, their self-report is not going to correctly reflect what is broken about the gigantic bureaucracy that then leads to Chernobyl or something like this. I think the incentives under which you operate are not always transparent to the members within that system. Yeah. So like it just feels like a strange coincidence that like there is benefit if you just zoom out and look at the system as opposed to asking individual lawyers, that making something hard to understand is going to make a lot of people money.
Yeah. Like
you're going to need a lawyer to figure that out, I guess, from the perspective of the individual. But then that could be the performative aspect. It could be as opposed to the incentive-driven to be complicated. It could be performative to where we lawyers speak in this sophisticated way and you regular humans don't understand it, so you need
upgrade your leaf deposits to level 8.
But it's suspicious. Suspicious that it's hard
use
to
my
understand,
diamonds,
and that everybody's eyes glaze over and they don't read.
I'm suspicious as well. I'm still suspicious.
Green M&Ms.
And I hear what you're saying. It could be kind of a, no individual, and even average of individuals, it could just be a few bad apples in a way which are driving the effect in some way.
Influential bad apples at the sort of that everybody looks up to or whatever. They're like central figures in how,
But it is
Vault level 9.
Interesting that among our 100 lawyers, they did not share.
They didn't want this. That's fascinating.
They really didn't like it. And so
and they weren't better than regular people at comprehending it, or they were on average better,
but they had the same difference.
The same difference.
Exact same difference. So they wanted it fixed. So they also, and so that gave us hope that because it actually isn't very hard to construct a material which is uncentered.
Stag beetle doesn't have a symbiotic relationship with ants.
It's not very hard to do. Just basically in that situation, you're just putting definitions outside of the subject-verb relation in that particular example, and that's pretty general. What they're doing is just throwing stuff in there which you didn't have to put in there. There's extra words involved. Typically, you may need a few extra words sort of to refer to the things that you're defining outside in some way, because if you only use it in that one sentence, then there's no reason to introduce extra terms. But so we might have a few more words, but it'll be easier to understand. So I mean, I have hope that now that maybe we can make legalese less convoluted in this. So
maybe the next president of the United States can, instead of saying generic things, say
exactly.
I ban center embeddings and make Ted the language czar of the United States.
Eric. Martinez is the guy you should really put in there. Yeah. I mean,
But center embeddings are the bad thing to have.
That's right.
So if you get rid of that,
that'll do a lot of it. That'll fix a lot.
Yeah, center embeddings make people have to stop the train of thought of what they're doing in a sequence of like recognizing what you're saying, and they have to refer back to something either by memory, which takes brain power, or by using their hands or whatever it is to get to that information again. Bro, you telling me I got to refer back to something I'm not looking at right now?
And so this is going back to
Could have been an email.
Claude Shannon was
It's not the same thing. Claude Shannon, the father of information theory. Take a look at the top right of his face.
Very influential piece of work about communication theory or information theory, and he was interested in human language. Actually, he was interested in this problem of communication, of getting a message from my head to your head, and so he was concerned or interested in what was a robust way to do that. And so that, assuming we both speak the same language, we both already speak English, whatever the language is, we speak that. What is a way that I can say the language so that it's most likely to get the signal that I want to you? And so, and then the problem there in the communication is the noisy channel. Is that there's a lot of noise in this system. I don't speak perfectly. I make errors. That's noise. There's background noise. You know that. As
noise in general.
Literal background noise. There is like white noise in the background or some other kind of noise, or some speaking going on that you're at a party. That's background noise. You're trying to hear someone. It's hard to understand them because there's all this other stuff going on in the background. And then there's noise on the communication on the receiver side, so that you have some problem maybe understanding me for stuff that's just internal to you in some way. So you've got some other problems, whatever, with understanding for whatever reasons. Maybe you had too much to drink. Who knows why you're not able to pay attention to the signal. So that's the noisy channel. And so that language, if it's a communication system, we are trying to optimize, in some sense, the passing of the message from one side to the other. And one idea is that maybe, aspects of like word order, for example, might have optimized in some way to make language a little more easy to be passed from speaker to listener. And so Shannon's the guy that did this stuff way back in the 40s. He, it's very interesting. Historically, he was interested in working in linguistics. He was at MIT, and this was his master's thesis of all things. It's crazy how much he did for his master's thesis in 1948, I think, or 49 something. And he wanted to keep working in language, and it just wasn't a popular communication as a source for what language wasn't popular at the time. So Chomsky was moving in there. He just wasn't able to get a handle there, I think. And so,
33 is still not the cap.
He moved to Bell Labs and worked on communication from a mathematical point of view, and was, did all kinds of amazing work. And so he's just
more on the signal side versus like the language side.
Yeah.
It would have been interesting to see if you pursued the language side. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, he was interested in that. His examples in the 40s are kind of like, they're very language-like things.
Yeah.
We can kind of show that there's a noisy channel process going on in when you're listening to me. You can often sort of guess what I meant by what what you think I meant given what I said. And I mean, with respect to sort of why language looks the way it does, there might be sort of, as I alluded to, there might be ways in which word order is somewhat optimized because of the noisy channel in some way.
I mean, that's really cool to sort of model if you don't hear certain parts of a sentence or have some probability of missing that part. Like, how do you construct a language that's resilient to that, that's somewhat robust to that?
Yeah, that's the idea.
And then you're kind of saying like the word order and the syntax of the language, the dependency length are all helpful.
Yeah, well, the dependency length is really about memory. Really, I think that's like about sort of what's easier or harder to produce in some way. Right. And these other ideas are about sort of robustness to communication. So the problem of potential loss of signal due to noise. Yeah. It's so that there may be aspects of word order which is somewhat optimized for that. And we have this one guess in that direction. And these are kind of just so stories. I have to be pretty frank. They're not. Like, I can't show this is true. All we can do is like look at the current languages of the world. This is we can't sort of see how languages change or anything because we've got these snapshots of a few 100 or a few thousand languages. We don't really we can't do the right kinds of modifications to test these things experimentally. And so, so just take this with a grain of salt. Okay, from here, this stuff, the dependency stuff, I'm much more solid on. I'm like, here's what the lengths are, and here's what's hard, and here's what's easy, and this is a reasonable structure. I think I'm pretty reasonable. Here's like why. Why does the word order look the way it does? We're now into shaky territory, but it's kind of cool.
But we're talking about, just to be clear, we're talking about maybe just actually the sounds of communication. Like you and I are sitting in a bar, it's very loud, and you model with a noisy channel the loudness, the noise, and we have the signal that's coming across. And you're saying word order might have something to do with optimizing that when there's a presence of noise.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting.
Yeah, the order of things, that would definitely make sense, and how well you understand it.
How much can you bake in? Well, you said like
you want to know what is doing something first.
End.
We think that there's at least three different kinds of things going on there, and we probably don't want to treat them.
An attack from an elephant 5 feet away is way less dangerous than an attack from an ant 5 feet away.
Background noise, speaker.
Danger is probably the number one thing that survival is probably the number one thing that people need to know about. So
a million other subsets.
Yes.
The subject of whatever you're talking about is probably going to be the thing.
I just mentioned cognitive load on both sides. Then there's like speech impediments or just everything. Worldview. I mean, the meaning will start to creep.
So we're going to 34, right?
We have different worldviews.
Well, how about just form still though? Like just what language you know? Like so how well you know the language. And so if it's second language for you versus first language, and how maybe what other languages you know. These are still just form stuff, and that's like potentially very informative. And how old you are. These things probably matter, right? So like a child learning a language is as a noisy representation of English grammar, depending on how old they are. So maybe when they're 6, they're perfectly formed. But
you mentioned one of the things is like a way to measure a language is learning problems. So like, what's the correlation between everything we've been talking about and how easy it is to learn a language? So is short dependencies correlated to ability to learn a language? Is there some kind of, or like the dependency grammar, is there some kind of connection there? How easy it is to learn?
Yeah, well, all the languages in the world's language, none is right now we know is any better than any other with respect to sort of optimizing dependency lengths, for example. They're all kind of do it well. They all keep low. I think of every human language as some kind of an optimization problem, a complex optimization problem to this communication problem. And so they've solved it, and they're just sort of noisy solutions to this problem of communication. There's just so many ways you can do this.
So they're not optimized for learning. They're probably
optimized for communication
and learning. So yes, one of the factors which is
communication first.
Yeah, so learning is messing this up a bit. Yeah. And so for example, if it were just about minimizing dependency lengths, and that was all that mattered, then we might find grammars which didn't have regularity in their rules. But languages always have regularity in their rules. So what I mean by that is that if I wanted to say something to you and the optimal way to say it was what really mattered to me, all that mattered was keeping the dependencies as close together as possible, then I would have a very lax set of phrase structure or dependency rules. I wouldn't have very many of those. I would have very little of that, and I would just put the words as close, the things that refer to the things that are connected right beside each other. But we don't do that. There are word order rules, right? So they're very, and depending on the language, they're more and less strict, right? So you speak Russian, they're less strict than English. English has very rigid word order rules. We order things in a very particular way. And so why do we do that? That's probably not about communication. That's probably about learning. I mean, then we're talking about learning. It's probably easier to learn regular things which are very predictable and easy to. So that's probably about learning is our guess, because that can't be about communication.
Can it be just noise? Can it be just the messiness of the development of a language?
Well, if it were just a communication, then we should have languages which have very, very free word order, and we don't have that. We have freer, but not free. Like there's always.
Well, no, but what I mean by noise is like cultural, like sticky cultural things, like the way you communicate. Just there's a stickiness to it that it's an imperfect, it's a noisy optimism, it's stochastic.
Yeah.
The function over which you're optimizing is very noisy.
Yeah.
So because it feels weird to say that learning is part of the objective function, because some languages are way harder to learn than others, right? Or is that's not true?
That's not true.
That's interesting.
I mean,
that's the public sort of perception, right?
Yes, that's true for a second language.
Don't need red.
But that depends on what you started with, right? So it really depends on how close that second language is to the first language you've got. And so yes, it's very hard to learn Arabic if you've started with English, or it's harder to learn Japanese, or if you've started with Chinese. I think is the worst. There's like Defense Language Institute in the United States has like a list of how hard it is to learn what language from English. I think Chinese is the worst.
But that's just a second language. You're saying babies don't care.
No, there's no evidence that there's anything harder or easier about any language learned like by 3 or 4 they speak that language, and so there's no evidence of anything harder or easier about any human language. They're all kind of equal.
So to what degree is language, this is returning to Chomsky a little bit, is innate? You said that for Chomsky, he used the idea that some aspects of language are innate to explain away certain things that are observed. But how much are we born with language at the core of our brain?
Okay, we don't need blues.
The answer is I don't know.
We don't need reds.
But I mean,
red and blue seem to be the most
I'm an engineer,
often
I guess, and I sort of think it's fine to postulate that a lot of it's learned, and so I'm guessing that a lot of it's learned. So I think the reason Chomsky went with the innateness is because he hypothesized movement in his grammar. He was interested in grammar, and movement's hard to learn. I think he's right. Movement is it's a hard thing to learn these two things together and how they interact. And there's like a lot of ways in which you might generate exactly the same sentences, and it's like really hard. And so he's like, I guess it's learned. Sorry, so I guess it's not learned, it's innate. And if you just throw out the movement and just think about that in a different way, then you get some messiness, but the messiness is human language, which it actually fits better. That messiness isn't a problem. It's actually it's a valuable asset of the theory. And so I think I don't really see a reason to postulate much innate structure, and that's kind of why I think these large language models are learning so well, is because I think you can learn the forms of human language from
no more reds, no more blues.
I think it's likely
just yellows.
So that part of the brain that lights up when you're doing all the comprehension, that could be learned. That could be just you don't need any.
It doesn't have to be innate. So like lots
all right,
of
we're
stuff
done with that.
Is modular in the brain that's learned. It doesn't have to, so there's something called the visual word form area in the back, and so it's in the back of your head near the visual cortex, okay? And that is very specialized very specialized brain area which does visual word processing if you're a reader, okay? If you don't read, you don't have it, okay? Guess what? You spend some time learning to read, and you develop that brain area which does exactly that. And so the modularization is not evidence for innateness. So the modularization of a language area doesn't mean we're born with it. We could have easily learned.
Maybe it's Maybelline.
We might have been born with it. We just don't know at this point. We might very well have been born with this left lateralized area. I mean, there's like a lot of other interesting components here, features of this kind of argument. So some people get a stroke or something goes really wrong on the left side, where the language area would be, and that isn't there. It's not available, and it develops just fine on the right. So it's not about the left. It goes to the left. Like this is a very
it's always about the
question
left.
Why are any of the brain areas the way that they are, and how did they come to be that way? And there's these natural experiments which happen where people get these strange events in their brains at very young ages, which wipe out sections of their brain.
Let's see if I can beat a 4100.
And they behave totally normally, and no one knows anything was wrong. And we find out later because they happen to be accidentally scanned for some reason. It's like, what happened to your left hemisphere? It's missing. There's not many people who miss their whole left hemisphere, but they'll be missing some other section of their left or their right, and they behave absolutely normal. We would never know. So that's like a very interesting, current research.
4400.
This is another project that this person, Fedorenko, is working on. She's got all these people contacting her because she's scanned some people who have been missing sections. One person missed a section of her brain and was scanned in her lab, and she happened to be a writer for the New York Times, and there was an article in the New York Times about the scanning procedure and about what might be learned about by sort of the general process of MRI and language, and not necessarily language, and because she's writing for the New York Times, then all these people started writing to her who also have similar kinds of deficits because they've been accidentally.
Where's my snail?
Scanned for some reason and found out they're missing some section. They volunteer to be scanned.
So these are natural experiments.
Natural experiments. They're kind of messy, but natural experiments. It's kind of cool. Yeah. I mean, she calls them interesting brains.
The first few hours, days, months of human life are fascinating. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, inside the womb, actually, like that development, that machinery, whatever that is, seems to create powerful humans that are able to speak, comprehend, think, all that kind of stuff, no matter what happens. Not no matter what, but robust to the different ways that the brain might be damaged and so on. That's really interesting. But what would Chomsky say about the thing you're saying now, that language seems to be happening separate from thought? Because as far as I understand, maybe you can correct me, he thought that language underpins.
Yeah, he thinks so. I don't know what he'd say.
I would think thought underpins language.
The idea is that language is the sort of the foundation of thought.
That's right.
No,
absolutely.
I don't think so.
It's pretty.
Language is developed from thought.
Mind blowing to think that it could be completely separate from thought.
That's right. But so he's basically a philosopher.
Language is a construct that was developed after thought, right? You have to think first before you can develop language.
You can't do a thought experiment to figure that out.
I think thoughts are more primordial than language. Just that's my general thought.
And that's what fMRI offers.
At a certain point, we'll be able to communicate with thoughts, and those thoughts will likely not be all language. They'll be pictures, images, feelings, whatever it is that you can experience. You could be experiencing it right now. That could be the whole purpose of existence, is I mean, not even purpose of existence, but it could be like a primary link in the chain of existence. The fact that we're here in this experience right now and experiencing whatever it is in communication with something else.
There's something special about them we don't know. But these are just
or whatever it is, right?
And
you don't know.
And you find
the rabbit hole of thought goes down.
It's very robust, I'd say.
Deep.
Fascinating effect.
Just ask Joe Rogan.
You mentioned Bolivia.
Mm-hmm.
What's the connection between culture and language?
I'm not necessarily saying I believe anything.
You've also mentioned that
for the purposes of this stream,
language,
but I will say
WEIRD, weird people, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
I will say.
So when you
and then I won't finish my sentence.
Remote cultures.
I hope that's cool.
Such as around the Amazon jungle.
I just got to build my ants,
So that term weird is from Joe Henrich.
My bug flipper.
Harvard. He's a Harvard evolutionary biologist. And so he works on lots of different topics. And he basically was pushing that observation that we should be careful about the inferences we want to make when we're talking in psychology or mostly in psychology, I guess, about humans. If we're talking about, undergrads at MIT and Harvard, those aren't the same, right? Mm-hmm. These aren't the same things. And so if you want to make inferences about language, for instance, there's a lot of other kinds of languages in the world than English and French and Chinese, and so maybe for language, we care about how culture, because cultures can be of course, English and Chinese cultures are very different, but hunter-gatherers are much more different in some ways. And so, if culture has an effect on what language is, then we kind of want to look there as well as looking. It's not like the industrialized cultures aren't interesting. Of course they are. But we want to look at non-industrialized cultures as well. And so I worked with two.
I feel like blues are the ones.
Chimani, which are in Bolivia and the Amazon, both in the Amazon in these cases. And there are so-called farmer foragers, which is not hunter-gatherers. It's sort of one up from hunter-gatherers in that they do a little bit of farming as well, a lot of hunting as well, but a little bit of farming. And the kind of farming they do is the kind of farming that I might do if I ever were to grow like tomatoes or something in my backyard. It's not like big field farming. It's just a farming for a family. A few things, you do that. And so that's the kind of farming they do. And the other group I've worked with are the Piraha, which are also in the Amazon and happen to be in Brazil. And that's with a guy called Dan Everett, who is a
Daniel Everett
anthropologist who actually lived and worked in he was
Please
a missionary actually initially back in the 70s, working trying to translate languages so they could teach them the Bible, teach them Christianity.
What can you say about that?
Yeah, so the two groups I've worked with, the Chimani and the Piraha, are both isolate languages, meaning there's no known connected languages at all.
36.
On their own.
Cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of those, and most of the isolates occur in the Amazon or in Papua New Guinea, and these places where the world has sort of stayed still for long enough, and there aren't earthquakes, there aren't certainly no earthquakes in the Amazon jungle, and the climate isn't bad.
Earth always sliding in the Amazon jungle.
And so, in Africa, you've got a lot of moving of people because there's drought problems. And so you get a lot of language contact when people have to, if you got to move because you got no water, then you got to get going. And then you run into contact with other tribes, other groups. In the Amazon, that's not the case. And so people can stay there for hundreds and hundreds and probably thousands of years.
Red is definitely the one.
Groups, the Chimani and the Piraha are both isolates in that, and I guess they've just lived there for ages and ages with minimal contact with other outside groups. And so I'm interested in them because they are, in these cases, I'm interested in their words. I would love to study their syntax, their orders of words, but I'm mostly just interested in how languages, are connected to their cultures in this way. And so with the Piraha, sort of most interesting, I was working on number there.
The Piraha.
So the basic idea is I think language is invented. Right? That's what I get from the words here is that I think language is invented. We talked about color earlier. It's the same idea. So that what you need to talk about with someone else is what you're going to invent words for. Okay. And so we invent labels for colors that I need, not that I can see, but that things I need to tell you about so that I can get objects from you or get you to give me the right objects.
Yes.
And I just don't need a word for teal or a word for aquamarine in the Amazon jungle for the most part, because I don't have two things which differ on those colors. I just don't have that. And so numbers are really another fascinating source of information here, where you might, naively, I certainly thought that all humans would have words for exact counting, and the Piraha don't. Okay, so they don't have.
This is that part that was at the beginning of the stream.
Even one. There's not a word for one in their.
They don't count
language. And so there's certainly not a word for 2, 3, or 4.
They don't need to.
So that kind of blows people's minds off. And
yeah, that's blowing my mind.
That's pretty weird.
How are you going to ask? I want 2 of those.
You just don't. And so that's just not a thing you can possibly ask in the Piraha. It's not possible. There's no words for that. So here's how we found this out. Okay, so it was thought to be a one-to-many language. There are 3 words for quantifiers for sets. But people had thought that those meant 1, 2, and many. But what they really mean is few, some, and many. Many is correct. It's few, some, and many. And so the way we
few, some, and many.
And this is kind of cool.
Few is like
that, we gave people
in relation to something that you either want more of or
these happen to be spools of thread.
Threatened by
what they are, identical objects. Right. And like
some
sort of
doesn't really matter.
Here, I just give
many
give
overwhelming.
You one of those and say, what's that? Okay, so you're a Piraha speaker, and you tell me what it is. And then I give you 2 and say, what's that? And nothing's changing in this set except for the number, okay? And then I just ask you to label these things. We just do this for a bunch of different people. And frankly, I did this task.
This is fascinating.
And it's a little bit weird. So they say the word that we thought was 1, it's few, but for the first one. And then maybe they say few, or maybe they say some for the second. And then for the third or the fourth, they start using the word many for the set. And then 5, 6, 7, 8, I go all the way to 10. And it's always the same word. And they look at me like I'm stupid because they told me what the word was for 6, 7, 8, and I'm going to continue asking them at 9 and 10. I'm like, I'm sorry, I just, they understand that I want to know their language. That's the point of the task, is like I'm trying to learn their language. And so that's okay. but it does seem like I'm a little slow because they already told me what the word for many was, 5, 6, 7, and I keep asking. So it's a little funny to do this task over and over. We did this with the guy called Dan was our translator. He's the only one who really speaks Piraha fluently. He's a good bilingual for a bunch of languages, but also in English and Piraha. And then a guy called Mike Frank was also a student with me down there. He and I did these things. And
I wonder if I'll get it this time.
Okay?
I can't see his health bar.
Everyone does the same thing. All we asked like 10 people, and they all do exactly the same labeling for 1 up. And then we just do the same thing down on like random order. Actually, we do some of them up, some of them down first, okay? And so we do, instead of 1 to 10, we do 10 down to 1. And so I give them 10, 9, at 8, they start saying the word for some. And then when you get to 4, everyone is saying the word for few, which we thought was 1. So it's like the context determined what that quantifier they used was. So it's not a count word. They're not count words. They're just
don't need blues.
words.
And they're going to be noisy when you interview a bunch of people. The definition of few and
right, because some people call it different things.
I don't know what that means. That's going to depend on the context. I think it's true in English too, right? If you ask an English person what a few is, I mean that's going to depend
I don't need red anymore
on the context.
And it might actually be at first hard to discover.
Yeah.
Because for a lot of people, the jump from 1 to 2 will be few. Right, so it's a jump.
Yeah, it might be.
I don't need yellow anymore.
Like I mean, that's fascinating.
I just need green.
Numbers don't present themselves.
Yeah. So the words aren't there, and so then we did these other things. Well, if they don't have the words, can they do exact matching kinds of tasks? Can they even do those tasks? And the answer is sort of yes and no. And so yes, they can do them. So here's the tasks that we did. We put out those spools of thread again. Okay, so maybe I put like 3 out here. And then we gave them some objects, and those happen to be uninflated red balloons. It doesn't really matter what they are. It's just they're a bunch of exactly the same thing, and it was easy to put down right next to these spools of thread, okay? And so then I put out 3 of these, and your task was to just put 1 against each of my 3 things. And they could do that perfectly. So, I mean, I would actually do that. It was a very easy task to explain to them because I did this with this guy, Mike Frank, and he would be I'd be the experimenter telling him to do this and showing him to do this, and then we just do it.
Barely.
Copy him.
Just by rearranging where the things were.
Except for copy him. Like, do what he did is like all we had to be able to say. And then they would do that just perfectly. And so we'd move it up. We'd do some sort of random number of items up to 10, and they basically do perfectly on that.
We'll see how long this one can go.
Wrong. I mean, that's not a count.
I'm going to move these guys.
That is just a match. You just put 1 against. It doesn't matter how many. I don't need to know how many there are there to do that correctly. And they would make mistakes, but very, very few, and no more than MIT undergrads. Just gonna say, like these are low stakes. So you make mistakes.
Counting is not required to complete the matching.
That's right. Not at all. Okay. And so that's our control. And this guy had gone down there before and said that they couldn't do this task, but I just don't know what he did wrong there because they can do this task perfectly well. And I can train my dog to do this task. So of course they can do this task. And so, it's not a hard task. But the other task that was sort of more interesting is so then we do a bunch of tasks where you need some way to encode the set.
A lot of advertisement.
One of them is just I just put a opaque sheet in front of the things. I put down a set of these things, and I put an opaque sheet down. And so you can't see them anymore. And I tell you, do the same thing you were doing before.
Boss.
Right? And it's easy if it's 2 or 3. It's very easy.
Do we still beat the boss?
But if I don't have the words for 8, it's a little harder. Like maybe with practice. Well, no.
Because you have to.
We do. We beat the next boss.
We just count them. It's just so.
Just by rearranging.
But they don't. They can't count them because they don't count. They don't have words for this thing, and so they would do approximate. It's totally fascinating. So they would get them approximately right. After 4 or 5. Because you can basically you always get 4 right. 3 or 4.
I think the boss always takes the top route.
That's something we can visually see.
Anyway.
But after that, you kind of have it's an approximate number, and so then there's a bunch of tasks we did, and they all failed. Failed. They did approximate after 5 on all those tasks, and it kind of shows that the words. You kind of need the words, to be able to do these kinds of tasks.
But there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing there, because if you don't have the words, then maybe they'll limit you in the kind of like a little baby Einstein there won't be able to come up with a counting task. You know what I mean? Like the the ability to count enables you to come up with interesting things, probably.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, you develop counting because you need it, but then once you have counting, you can probably come up with a bunch of different inventions, like how to, I don't know, what kind of thing. They do matching really well for building purposes, building some kind of hut or something like this. So it's interesting that language is a limiter on what you're able to do.
Yeah. Here, language is the words. Here is the words. Like the words for exact count is the limiting factor here. They just don't have them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
That limit is also a limit on the society of what they're able to build.
That's going to be true. Yeah.
Oh, so we got a bunch of pops.
I mean, we don't know. This is one of those problems with the snapshot of just current languages, is that we don't know what causes a culture to discover / invent a counting system. But the hypothesis is, the guess out there, is something to do with farming. So if you have a bunch of goats and you want to keep track of them, and you have 17 goats, and you go to bed at night and you get up in the morning, boy, it's easier to have a count system to do that. That's an abstraction over a set. So that I don't have, like, people often ask me when I tell them about this kind of work, they say, well, don't these Piraha, don't they have kids? Don't they have a lot of children? I'm like, yeah, they have a lot of children. And they do. They often have families of 3 or 4 or 5 kids. And they go, well, don't they need the numbers to keep track of their kids? And I always ask this person who says this, like, do you have children? And the answer is always no, because that's not how you keep track of your kids. Yeah. You care about their identities. It's very important to me when I go, I have 5 children. It doesn't matter which. Yeah, it matters which 5. It's like if you replaced one with someone else, I would care. A goat, maybe not, right? That's the kind of point. It's an abstraction. Something that looks very similar to the one wouldn't matter to me, probably.
But
you got 15 more minutes on the ant stream.
Know them actually.
It's been a lot of fun.
Also.
Yeah, you will.
I mean,
afterwards, I'm going to be playing some cards for.
You're absolutely right. But
for I guess about an hour.
Such that you don't have to.
That way you guys can see this game. Called Parallels.
That's the hypothesis, not mine.
It's pretty good.
From anthropologists is guessing about where words for counting came from, is from farming, maybe. Anyway.
Yeah. Do you have a sense why universal languages like Esperanto have not taken off? Like, why do we have all these different languages?
Yeah. Well, my guess is the function of a language is to do something in a community, and I mean, unless there's some function to that language in the community, it's not going to survive. It's not going to be useful. So here's a great example. So what I'm like. Language death is super common, okay?
Language death.
Languages are dying all
Makes
around
sense.
the world. And here's why they're dying.
Superior languages.
Like, I see this in it's not happening right now in either the Chimane or the Piraha, but it probably will. And so there's a neighboring group called Mositan, which is I said that it's isolate. It's actually, there's a dual. There's 2 of them. Okay, so it's actually, there's 2 languages which are really close, which are Mositan and Chimane, which are unrelated to anything else. And Mositan is unlike Chimane in that it has a lot of contact with Spanish, and it's dying. So that language is dying. The reason it's dying is there's not a lot of value for the local people in their native language. So there's much more value in knowing Spanish, like, because they want to feed their families. And how do you feed your family? You learn Spanish so you can make money, so you can get a job and do these things, and then you make money. And so they want Spanish things. So Mositan is in danger and is dying. And that's normal. And so basically the problem is that people, the reason we learn language is to communicate, and we use it to make money and to do whatever it is to feed our families. And if that's not happening, then it won't take off. It's not like a game or something. This is like something we use. Like, why is English so popular? It's not because it's an easy language to learn. Maybe it is. I don't really know. But that's not why it's popular.
But because it's the United States is a gigantic economy, and therefore
it's big economies that do this. It's all it is. It's all about money, and that's what. And so there's a motivation to learn Mandarin. There's a motivation to learn Spanish. There's a motivation to learn English. These languages are very valuable to know because there's so many speakers all over the world.
That's fascinating.
There's less of a value economically. It's like kind of what drives this. It's not just for fun. I mean, there are these groups that do want to learn language just for language's sake, and they want, and there's something to that. But those are rare. Those are rarities in general. Those are a few small groups that do that. Not most people don't do that.
Well, if that was the primary driver, then everybody was speaking English or speaking one language. There's also attention.
That's happening.
We're
moving towards fewer and fewer languages. Exactly.
We are.
Yeah,
I wonder if you're right. Maybe on a this is slow.
Yeah.
But maybe that's where we're moving. But there is a tension. You're saying languages at the fringes, but if you look at geopolitics and superpowers,
destroy level 1 predator
it
nest.
does seem that there's another thing at tension, which is a language is a national identity sometimes.
Oh,
for certain nations. I mean, that's the war in Ukraine. Ukrainian language is a symbol of that war in many ways, like a country fighting for its own identity. So it's not merely the convenience. I mean, those two things are at tension. Is the convenience of trade and the economics, and be able to communicate with neighboring countries and trade more efficiently with neighboring countries, all that kind of stuff, but also identity.
That's right.
Of the group.
I completely agree.
Because language is the way, for every community, like dialects that emerge are a kind of identity for people.
Yeah.
And sometimes a way for people
we
to
just
say
rallied, guys. That's one of the challenges.
Powerful people. And it's interesting. So in that way, language can be used as that tool.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's a lot of work to try to create that identity so people want to do that. As a cognitive scientist and language expert, I hope that continues, because I don't want languages to die. I want languages to survive, because because they're so interesting for
10 minutes,
for so many reasons.
And we were able to talk about the Monty Hall problem.
But I think there's a lot of connections to culture as well, which is also very important.
Do you have hope for machine translation that can break down the barriers of language? So while all these different diverse languages exist, I guess there's many ways of asking this question, but basically, how hard is it to translate in an automated way from one language to another?
There's going to be cases where it's going to be really hard, right? So there are concepts that are in one language and not in another. Like the most extreme kinds of cases are these cases of number information. So good luck translating a lot of English into Piraha. It's just impossible. There's no way to do it, because there are no words for these concepts that we're talking about. There's probably the flip side, right? There's probably stuff in Piraha which is going to be hard to translate into English on the other side. And so I just don't know what those concepts are. I mean, the world space is
don't need green
from my world space, and so I don't know what so that the things they talk about, things are, it's going to have to do with their life as opposed to my industrial life, which is going to be different. And so there's going to be problems like that always. There's maybe it's not so bad in the case of some of these spaces, and maybe it's going to be harder in others. And so it's pretty bad in number. It's extreme, I'd say, in the number space, exact number space. But in the color dimension, right? So that's not so bad. But it's a problem that you don't have ways to talk about the concepts.
And there might be entire concepts that are missing. So to you, it's more about the space of concept versus the space of form. Like form, you can probably map.
Yes. Yeah. But so you were talking earlier about translation and about how translations, there's good and bad translations. I mean, now we're talking about translations of form, right? So what makes a writing good, right? It's
There's
not
a music
just
to the form,
right? It's not just the content. It's it's how it's written, and translating that. That sounds difficult.
We should say that there is I hesitate to say meaning, but there's a music and a rhythm to the form when you look at the broad picture, like the difference between Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, or Hemingway, Bukowski, James Joyce, like I mentioned. There's a beat to it. There's an edge to it that is in the form.
We can probably get measures of those.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm optimistic that we could get measures of those things, and so maybe that's mappable.
Translatable.
I don't know though. I have not worked on that.
I would love to see
that sounds totally fascinating.
Translation to Hemingway is probably the lowest. I would love to see different authors, but the average per sentence dependency length for Hemingway is probably the shortest.
That's your sense, huh? It's simple sentences with short.
Sentences.
Yeah, short. Yeah.
I mean, that's when, if you have really long sentences, even if they don't have center embedding, like
they can have longer connections. Yeah,
they can have longer connections.
They don't have to, right? You can have a long sentence with a bunch of local words. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is much more likely.
The yellow ones are the most
fancies with long sentences. Yeah.
Rare.
I met a guy named Azaraskin who does a lot of cool stuff. Really brilliant. Works with Tristan Harris and a bunch of stuff. But he was talking to me about communicating with animals. He co-founded Earth Species Project, where you're trying to find the common language between whales, crows, and humans. And he was saying that there's a lot of promising work that, even though the signals are very different,
right? Like
the actual if you have embeddings of the languages, they're actually trying to communicate similar type things. And is there something you can comment on that? Like, where is there promise to that in everything you've seen in different cultures, especially remote cultures, that this is a possibility?
And I'll take green.
That we can talk to whales.
I would say yes. I think it's not crazy at all. I think it's quite reasonable. There's this sort of weird view, odd view, I think, that to think that human language is somehow special. I mean, it is. Maybe it is. We can certainly do more than any of the other species. And maybe our language system is part of that. It's possible. But people have often talked about how human, like Chomsky, in fact, has talked about how only human language has, this compositionality thing that he thinks is sort of key in language. And it's the problem with that argument is he doesn't speak whale. And he doesn't speak crow, and he doesn't
Does
speak
he, though?
He's like they say things like, well, they're making a bunch of grunts and squeaks, and that the reasoning is like, that's bad reasoning. Like, I'm pretty sure if you asked a whale what we're saying, they'd say, well, I'm making a bunch of weird noises.
Exactly.
And so it's like, this is a very odd reasoning to be making, that human language is special because we're the only ones who have human language. I'm like, well, we don't know what those we just don't. We can't talk to them yet. And so there probably a signal in there, and it might very well be something complicated like human language. I mean, sure, with a small brain in lower species, there's probably not a very good communication system, but in these higher species where you have, what seems to be, abilities to communicate something, there might very well be a lot more signal there than than we might have otherwise thought.
But also, if we have a lot of intellectual humility here, there's somebody formerly from MIT, Neri Oxman, who I admire very much, has worked on communicating.
I don't need green and I don't need red.
So, yes, the signal there is even less than, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that all nature has a way of communicating, and it's a very different language. But they do develop a kind of language through the chemistry, through some way of communicating with each other. And if you have enough humility about that possibility, I think you can. I think it would be a very interesting, in a few decades, maybe centuries, hopefully not, a humbling possibility of being able to communicate not just between humans, effectively, but between all of living things on Earth.
Well, I mean, I think some of them are not going to have much interesting to say, but
you
some
could
of them
still...
will. We don't know. We certainly don't know.
I don't need blue, green, or red. I need yellow.
There could be some interesting trees out there.
Yeah. Well, they're probably talking to other trees, right? They're not talking to us. And so to the extent they're talking, they're saying something interesting to some other, conspecific as opposed to us, right? And so there may be some signal there. So there are people out there. Actually, it's pretty common to say that human language is special and different from any other animal communication system. And I just don't think the evidence is there for that claim. I think it's not obvious. We just don't know what because we don't speak these other communication systems until we get better. I do think there are people working on that, as you pointed out, though, people working on whale speak, for instance. That's really fascinating. Yeah.
Let me ask you a wild, out there sci-fi question. If we make contact with an intelligent alien civilization and you get to meet them, how hard do you think how surprised would you be about their way of communicating? Do you think it'd be recognizable? Maybe there's some parallels here to when you go to the remote tribes.
I mean, I would want Dan Everett with me. He is like amazing at learning foreign languages, and so this is an amazing feat, right? To be able to go. This is a language, Piedmont, which has no translators before him. I mean, there were.
Wow.
He was a missionary. Went there. Well, there was a guy that had been there before, but he wasn't very good, and so he learned the language far better than anyone else had learned before.
That's really close.
He's like good at. He's a very social person. I think that's a big part of it, is being able to interact. So I don't know. It kind of depends on this species from outer space, how much they want to talk to us.
Is there something you can say about the process he follows? Like how do you show up to a tribe and socialize? I mean, I guess colors and counting is one of the most basic things to figure out.
Yeah, you actually start with like objects.
Yes.
And just say, you just throw a stick down and say stick, and then you say, what do you call this? They do this feature, and then they'll say the word whatever. And he says the standard thing to do is to throw two sticks, and then he learned pretty quick that there weren't any count words in this language, because they didn't know this wasn't interesting. I mean, it was kind of weird. They'd say some or something, the same word over and over again. And so, but that is a standard thing. You just but you have to be pretty out there socially, like willing to talk to random people, which these are, really very different people from you. And he's very social. And so I think that's a big part of this, is like, that's how, a lot of people know a lot of languages, is they're willing to talk to other people.
That's a tough one, where you just show up.
We got our last minute, guys.
Oh God,
that's a beautiful.
Do you have any questions
that humans are able to connect
about Ant Legion? Now's the time.
You've had an incredible career exploring this fascinating topic. What advice?
This has been an awesome
about how to have a career.
An awesome episode on syntax
or life that they can be proud of.
When you see something interesting, just go and do it. Like I do that. Like that's something I do, which is kind of unusual for most people. So like when I saw the Piedmont was available to go and visit, I was like, yes, I'll go. And then when we couldn't go
shoot
back,
me a message if you decide to download the game.
Brazilian government,
or like a clan or something like that.
Go back in.
Let me know if you tried out what you think.
Group. And so we searched around, and we were able to find the Chimani, because I wanted to keep working on this kind of problem. And so we found the Chimani and just go there. We didn't have contact. We had a little bit of contact and brought someone, and that was, you just kind of just try things. I say it's like a lot of that's just like ambition. Just try to do something that other people haven't done. Just give it a shot is what I do that all the time.
I'm going to take a few minutes.
And I love the fact
get
that
myself together.
Has landed you
come back and play some.
This was an incredible conversation. That you're
some parallel.
You're just a fascinating human being. Thank you for taking a journey through human language with me today. This is awesome.
Thank you very much, Lex. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Edward Gibson.
That was it.
To support this podcast, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, let me leave you with some words from Wittgenstein. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time.
I guess it is true, guys. Like the video. Hope you enjoyed that. And that's all I got.
You can't afford to stay.
I'll be right back with some parallel. We'll see you there. Download the game. Check it out. It's free.